He buried her 6 months ago. Closed casket. No body to hold, no face to kiss goodbye. Just a box and the lie that she was inside it. Kang Tae-hyun, the most feared man in East Asia's criminal underworld, knelt in the rain and let them lower the empty weight of his entire reason for living into the ground. He became something worse after that, something without mercy, without hesitation, without a single human thread left to pull him back from the edge. Then a tray crashes in a forgotten roadside diner outside Seoul, and he hears her voice. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you never miss what happens next. Let's begin. The storm came in from the Yellow Sea sometime before midnight, the kind of autumn storm that didn't announce itself. It just arrived, cold and absolute, pressing down on the city of Seoul like a hand over a mouth. By the time Kang Tae-hyun's black convoy rolled off the expressway and onto the cracked two-lane road that cut through the outer districts, the rain was coming sideways, hammering the windows of his armored SUV in waves that sounded like gravel being thrown by fistfuls. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His chief of security, a broad-shouldered man named Ryu, who had been with him for 11 years, watched him from the front passenger seat through the rear-view mirror. Ryu had learned long ago not to speak unless spoken to, especially during the stretches like this one. When Tae-hyun went quiet in that particular way, jaw set, eyes fixed on nothing, hands resting flat on his thighs like he was trying to keep them still by force of will alone. The convoy had left a meeting in Incheon that had ended badly. 3 dead. 2 of them Tae-hyun's men, one of them a negotiator from a Busan faction who had said something he shouldn't have said about the old days. About Amara, specifically, about how maybe Tae-hyun's grief had made him reckless. The man hadn't finished the sentence. Tae-hyun hadn't needed him to. He stared at the rain on the window now and felt nothing about it. That was the thing that had changed most in the past 6 months. Not the violence. He'd always been capable of that. It was the absence of the feeling that used to come after. The weight. The second guessing. All of that had gone into the ground with her, and what was left behind was just a man-shaped piece of machinery that ran cold and efficient and never slowed down. "There's a diner coming up," Ryu said, watching the GPS. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Tae-hyun didn't answer. "Boss." "I heard you." The convoy slowed anyway. Some instinct, some small automated thing that still ran in the background of his body even when the rest of him had gone dark, made him reach forward and knock twice on the back of Ryu's headrest. The driver pulled in. The diner was the kind of place that existed in the space between things. Between city and countryside. Between solvent and bankrupt. Between a business and the memory of one. A hand-painted sign hung above the door with half the letters faded beyond reading. The parking lot held 2 trucks and a rusted hatchback. Yellow light bled through the condensation-fogged windows. It smelled, even from outside in the rain, like fried oil and old coffee and something faintly sweet that Tae-hyun couldn't identify and didn't try to. 2 of his security men went in first. Standard procedure. Ryu followed with Tae-hyun at his shoulder, the remaining men fanning out around the perimeter of the lot, quiet and practiced as a closing hand. The interior was a single long room, booths along the windows, a counter with 6 stools, a kitchen barely concealed behind a pass-through window, above which hung a handwritten menu in both Korean and English, the English version clearly added as an afterthought, and spelled with the kind of confident inaccuracy that comes from never having needed to check. 4 customers. An old farmer in a corner booth nursing something hot. 2 long-haul truckers at the counter, their backs turned, talking low. A teenage boy in a school uniform asleep face down on the table nearest the door. A half-eaten bowl of ramyun gone cold at his elbow. A diner owner. A heavy-set man in his 50s with grease-stained sleeves and the specific, permanently aggrieved expression of someone who has been losing money slowly for many years. Appeared from the kitchen and took in the sudden arrival of 3 men in tailored dark clothing with the dead-eyed look of people who don't go anywhere unarmed. He said nothing. He pointed at the booth in the back corner, farthest from the door, as though he'd been expecting exactly this class of customer and had prepared accordingly. Tae-hyun slid into the booth. Ryu took up a position at the counter, close enough. The two security men remained just inside the door. The diner went on breathing around them. Taehyun picked up the laminated menu and looked at it without reading it. His eyes felt like sandpaper. The fluorescent light above his booth buzzed faintly, a high, thin sound at the edge of perception, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a splinter. Not quite pain, just presence. The rain against the windows was steady and hard. He set the menu down. He thought about the meeting in Incheon. He thought about the man who had mentioned Amara's name. He thought about how little he'd felt doing what he'd done afterward, and whether that absence of feeling was something that would eventually come back, or whether it was permanent now, just the new shape of him. He had almost decided to leave, to knock twice on the table and signal Ryu that they were moving on, when he heard the sound from the kitchen, a door banging open. Then footsteps, quick and slightly uneven, the kind of gait that comes from carrying unexpected weight in front of you and having not yet fully adjusted to where your center of gravity has gone. And then the passage of something through the air, a hand catching a tray rack, and then the rack failing anyway. The tray hit the floor with a crack that cut through every other sound in the room. Dishes, ceramic, a coffee pot. All of it going at once in a cascade that brought the old farmer's head up and made one of the truckers turn on his stool. And then, behind the sound of breaking things, a voice. Just two syllables of a Korean apology, breathed out rather than spoken. The sound of someone who had already been tired before this happened and now had to deal with this too. The voice hit Tae-hyun like a physical blow. He did not move. He stopped breathing. It was not a dramatic recognition, not a Hollywood moment of swelling emotion and certainty all at once. It was instead a very small, very violent tearing sensation somewhere below his sternum, like something that had been sutured shut was pulling against the stitches. Because he knew that voice. He had known that voice for 4 years. He had heard it in arguments and in laughter, and in the specific low murmur it made at 2 a.m. when she was trying to get back to sleep and couldn't. He had heard it go cold with disappointment, and he had heard it break with something too complicated to name. He knew every color that voice was capable of making. He had stood in the rain 6 months ago and listened to people say words over a box and told himself that voice was gone from the world. He raised his eyes slowly. She was on her knees on the kitchen floor, gathering broken pieces of ceramic with hands that were shaking slightly, her dark hair fallen forward over her face. She was wearing the diner's uniform, a pale blue apron over dark clothing, and the apron was stretched taut over a stomach that was large and round and unmistakable. 7 months. Maybe more. The calculation happened in some part of his brain that had kept running while the rest of him had locked up completely. She hadn't looked up yet. She was focused on the floor, on the broken things, on getting through the next 30 seconds of her immediate situation. The diner owner had appeared from behind the counter and was moving toward her, and Tae-hyun watched him reach down and grab her arm above the elbow to pull her up, not gently, with the particular impatience of someone who is watching money happen on his floor. Amara looked up. Her eyes went to the room, to the truckers, to the farmer, to the door, moving the way eyes move when they have spent a long time performing that specific sweep, cataloging exits and strangers and risks before anything else. It was a habit she'd never had before. It was a habit she had learned somewhere in the last 6 months, and seeing it on her face, that new wariness, that practiced fear, it hit him harder than the sound of her voice had. Then her eyes found him. And everything stopped. The noise of the rain, the buzz of the fluorescent light, the low conversation of the truckers. All of it went to silence in his perception, replaced by the single fact of her face. The face he had memorized and then tried to unmake himself from loving and then had carried anyway, embedded in him like shrapnel, because some things don't come out no matter how much you want them to. She was alive. She was here. She was looking at him like he was the thing she was most afraid of in this room. Tae-hyun became aware that he was standing. He didn't remember standing up. He was out of the booth, on his feet, and he had no memory of the motion at all, and Ryu was already moving from the counter with one hand reaching toward his shoulder to slow him down. And Tae-hyun stepped around him without breaking eye contact with her, without feeling the contact, without feeling anything except the terrible specific gravity of the space between where he stood and where she was. Amara tried to get up. The weight of the pregnancy made it awkward. She got 1 foot under her and pushed and made it halfway. And then the diner owner tightened his grip on her arm to pull her the rest of the way. And the way he did it, the carelessness of it, The obliviousness to what she was holding and what she was carrying did something clean and cold to Tae-hyun's thinking. He crossed the floor in 4 steps. He took the man's wrist in his hand. He bent it backward to the precise angle at which a wrist breaks, applied the weight, and felt the exact moment of failure beneath his fingers, the small interior collapse that a joint makes when it goes. The diner owner dropped. He made a sound like a dog that had been stepped on and went to his knees, and Tae-hyun held the wrist for 1 additional second to make sure the message was complete before releasing. The room had gone perfectly still. Tae-hyun didn't look at any of them. He was looking at Amara, who had pressed herself back against the edge of the counter, one hand flat against the wall and the other arm curled around the front of her stomach. Not against him specifically, not yet, just the automatic positioning of a woman whose body had spent 6 months making that particular gesture and had gotten fast at it. "Take your hands off my wife," he said. He said it quietly. He wasn't interested in volume. Volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. Amara's face had gone through 3 different things in the space of a few seconds and was now settling on something that wasn't surprise anymore. It was something older and harder and more complicated than surprise. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were wet, but not spilling. She was holding it back through what looked like considerable effort. And she was breathing through her nose in a way that was controlled and deliberate, the breathing of someone who had learned to manage physiological panic in real time. "Don't," she said. 1 word. He would have given everything he'd accumulated in 11 years of building an empire for the right to take a single step toward her, and she stopped him with 1 syllable. "Don't come any closer." He heard it. He stopped. His security men had arranged themselves in a loose perimeter around the room. The truckers were very still on their stools. The old farmer had not moved. The teenager was awake now, blinking, no idea what he had woken up into. Tae-hyun looked at Amara and tried to find the right thing to say. He was a man who had conducted negotiations in rooms where people were bleeding, who had given orders that changed the shape of things for hundreds of people, who had spoken at his own wife's funeral in front of men who would have killed him if they'd sensed any real weakness in that moment. And standing here looking at her alive, he could not find a single word. "You're alive," was what came out, and it was inadequate by any measure. Something crossed her face. Not relief, not softness. Something sharp and compressed, like everything she'd been holding had sharpened itself to a point. "No thanks to you," she said. He heard the words. They registered. But the full weight of them took a moment to arrive, the way the sound of a distant impact comes after the sight of the thing happening. "What? You sent them?" Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they've already broken once and been put back together deliberately. "You sent men to kill me. I saw the message, Tae-hyun. I saw your number. I saw the order." The room had gone the kind of quiet where you can hear your own pulse. Tae-hyun's mind was doing several things at once. Part of it was still processing the fundamental fact of her existence. She was standing here. She was breathing. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had spent 6 months somewhere that had taught her to check exits and manage her own fear and speak to him like he was something to be survived. Part of it was parsing what she'd just said. And part of it, the cold, operational part that never fully went offline, the part that had run his organization through a period of grief-driven violence, that had reshaped the criminal landscape of 3 countries, was already running the math on what she was describing. A message from his private number, an order to kill her. He didn't say I didn't send it because she had clearly already been through that argument with herself many times over 6 months, and had arrived somewhere past the point where his denial would mean anything without evidence to hold it up. He said, "Show me." "I don't have it anymore." She hadn't moved from the counter. "I destroyed everything, every phone, every SIM, everything that could have traced me. I was 6 weeks pregnant, and I was hiding in a truck heading to Busan with nothing because the alternative was staying long enough for your people to finish the job. 6 weeks pregnant, which meant she had been pregnant before the supposed explosion, which meant she had been pregnant and he hadn't known, and she had found out she was pregnant at approximately the same moment she'd discovered, or believed she'd discovered, that the father of the child wanted her dead, and she had spent the subsequent months alone and afraid and in hiding while he had spent those same months becoming something that even the men who worked for him were frightened of. Tae-hyun became aware that his hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs. Old habit. Control was the one thing he'd never been willing to relinquish in front of anyone, and he wasn't going to start now, not even here, not even with this. Who showed it to you? He said. The message. Who? She looked at him for a long moment, measuring something, deciding something. Min-kyu, she said. The name sat in the air between them. Taehyun heard it and felt the specific sensation of understanding arriving before he was ready for it. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of a thing that you have not yet consciously suspected, but which, once named, fits perfectly into a shape that was always there waiting for it. Seo Min-kyu, his second in command, his oldest friend. The man who had stood at his shoulder at the funeral and wept. Wept in a way that had seemed, at the time, like the grief of a man who had also loved her, who had also lost something that day. Before Taehyun could say anything, Ryu appeared at his elbow. Boss? The word was flat and clipped, and the tone of it meant right now. Taehyun turned. Through the fogged diner windows, in the rain-blurred dark of the parking lot, he could see the headlights. Several sets. Approaching without the hesitation of vehicles that were lost or looking for a place to stop. Coming in fast, fanning out across the lot to cut off the exits. Moving with the coordinated deliberateness of people who had been sent somewhere to do something specific. His two men at the door were already moving, one reaching under his jacket, one stepping to the side to angle away from the window glass. Taehyun turned back to Amara. How long have you been at this diner? He said. 3 weeks. Did you use your real name? No, I've used 4 different names in 6 months. Did you contact anyone? Anyone who knew you before? The slight pause before she answered told him everything. My cousin in Chicago, she said. Once, 2 months ago. I needed to know if anyone was looking for me officially, if there was a death certificate. She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was a burner. I was careful. Not careful enough, he said. And he said it without judgment, because there wasn't time for judgment. How's the kitchen? Is there a back door? Taehyun, Amara. He said her name like it cost him something. And maybe it did, because this was the first time it had been anything other than a private wound in 6 months. We are going to have the rest of this conversation. Everything you saw, everything Min-kyu told you, everything. We are going to go through all of it, but right now there are men in that parking lot who were sent here to make sure neither of us makes it to that conversation. So I need you to tell me about the back door. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. The hand on her stomach didn't move. Past the grill, she said. Loading dock. Padlocked, but the chain is old. Go. I'm not going anywhere with you. The first window came in. It wasn't gunfire. It was a brick. A simple crude thing, thrown hard enough to blow through the glass in a sideways spray that sent the teenage boy scrambling off his bench and onto the floor, and the truckers going off their stools in opposite directions, and the old farmer, who had apparently seen worse in his life, simply ducking below the table with a patience that suggested he'd been waiting for something like this since he sat down. Then the shooting started. The first shots came from outside, suppressed, flat, punching through the window frame and the diner wall above the counter in a line that tracked left to right as whoever was firing tried to find the position of Taehyun's men. His men didn't give them the position. They were already moving, using the counter and the booth frames for cover, returning fire in controlled pairs, disciplined and cold. Taehyun moved to Amara. She was already moving, not toward the door, not freezing, but back toward the kitchen, which told him something about what 6 months on the run had done to her instincts. He caught up to her at the kitchen doorway and put his body between her and the front of the diner, and she felt the contact and went rigid for a moment. He felt it through his arm, the flinch, the hardening, and then she was moving again, and he was moving with her. The kitchen was small and very hot. The owner was on the floor in the corner with his broken wrist pulled to his chest, looking at nothing. A prep cook in his 20s had pressed himself against the far wall, holding a ladle like he wasn't sure whether to use it. Taehyun scanned the room. Fryer, grill, prep table, walk-in freezer on the left, and there, past the grill. The loading dock door, heavy steel, a padlock chain looped through the push bar. He crossed to it in 4 steps. The chain was old, He picked up a heavy cast iron skillet from the edge of the grill without breaking stride and brought it down on the lock with everything he had. Once the lock held, twice it didn't. The chain fell. He hit the push bar and the door opened onto a narrow dock above a concrete loading apron, and the rain came in immediately, cold and sideways and relentless. Behind him in the diner, the shooting had escalated. At least 2 of his security men were still operating. He could track the positions by the patterns of return fire. Ryu's voice, briefly, calling a position in the flat, clipped shorthand they used. Taehyun stepped onto the dock and turned back. Amara was in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame, looking at him across the distance of the room. The prep cook had flattened himself lower. The sound of the firefight in the front room was a continuous overlapping noise of suppressed shots and breaking things and something heavier hitting the floor. The expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who trusted him, but she came. She moved through the kitchen with that new careful gait that was wrong in all the specific ways pregnancy makes things wrong. Deliberate, compensating. One hand resting on her stomach, not in tenderness, but in the automatic protection of something she'd been guarding for 6 months. And she reached the door, and he reached back and took her arm to help her down the 2 steps from the dock to the concrete, and she let him do it. She let him touch her. She didn't lean into it, didn't soften, didn't yield anything, but she let him. He counted it. The loading apron opened onto a narrow service road that ran behind the diner and the 2 adjacent closed businesses. A hardware supplier, a tiling company, both dark. His convoy was in the front lot. Getting back to it through the building was not going to happen. At the far end of the service road, maybe 200 meters, he could see a gap between buildings that would open onto the main road. "Can you run?" he said. "I've been doing a lot of things for 6 months that I didn't think I could do," she said. He took that as a yes. They moved. The rain was brutal, the kind of rain that removes visibility down to 20 meters and makes every surface sound the same. Behind them, through the back wall of the diner, the gunfire was shifting, becoming more sporadic, and Taehyun didn't know yet whether that meant his men were winning or losing, and there was no way to find out that didn't involve turning around, which he was not going to do. He stayed close to Amara without touching her, close enough that if she stumbled, he could catch it, watching her footing on the wet concrete, watching the gap at the end of the road. She was moving faster than he'd expected. She was also breathing hard in a way that was not panic but effort, the controlled effort of someone managing a physical limitation that she had gotten used to managing. Halfway down the service road, a figure emerged from the gap at the far end. Taehyun's hand was already moving to the inside of his jacket. The figure turned, saw them, hesitated, and Taehyun clocked the shape of him in the rain, the coat, the positioning, and took the shot in the same motion. One round, center mass, suppressed. The figure went down without a sound. Amara hadn't stopped moving. He looked at her sidelong as they passed the body. She looked straight ahead. He added that to his accounting of what she'd become in 6 months. At the end of the road, a left turn took them onto the main road, which was empty in both directions. The storm had driven everything inside. 200 meters to the right, a line of dark shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the sky resolved, as they moved closer, into a row of low buildings that included what appeared to be a shuttered gas station, and behind it, a structure he recognized. He recognized it because he'd bought it 4 years ago under a corporate shell that had never been connected to him publicly. One of a network of properties he'd accumulated precisely because there are moments when you need somewhere to go that doesn't exist in any record anyone can find. He told himself, when he bought it, that he was being practical. The truth, which he hadn't examined closely at the time, was that he'd been thinking about her, about what it would take to keep her safe if his world ever came for her, the way his world always eventually came for everything. He thought about that now. How he'd been preparing for this possibility and hadn't known it, and how the threat he'd been preparing for had come from somewhere he'd never thought to guard against. He put his shoulder against the side door of the building, and it gave with the particular quality of a door that was well maintained and properly sealed, and had simply been waiting to be opened. He got Amara inside and pulled the door closed behind them and stood for a moment in the dark with the sound of the rain locked outside. He found the light switch. A single overhead bulb came on, industrial and plain, illuminating a space that was half storage and half the kind of functional safe room that you furnish with practicality rather than comfort. A cot, a water filtration unit, a locked cabinet that held a first aid kit, and a radio and a Glock 19 that Tae-hyun had left there years ago, still in its case. The floor was concrete. The walls were thick. There was no window. Amara looked around the room and then looked at him. "What is this place?" she said. "Somewhere safe. Did you buy it to keep me here?" The question had a specific edge on it that he understood. She was asking whether this was captivity, whether safe meant contained. "No," he said. "I bought it so you'd have somewhere to go if I couldn't protect you in the open. There's no lock on that door from the inside." He stepped away from the door deliberately. "You can leave whenever you want." She stayed where she was. She was dripping water onto the concrete floor and pressing one hand into the small of her back in a way that said she'd been on her feet all day before this happened. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine. You're 7 months pregnant and we just ran 200 meters in a storm after a firefight." She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a person who is too tired to maintain the argument and too proud to concede it, and then she sat on the cot. The silence between them was not empty. It was completely full, packed with 6 months of events on both sides, with everything she'd endured and everything he'd done, with the gap between the person she'd left and the person she was now looking at across a concrete room in the middle of the night. "Min-kyu showed you a message," Tae-hyun said. He had lowered himself onto the cabinet, not close, not crowding her. "Sent from my private number. Encrypted," she said. "The format was right. The header was right. The number was your number. He showed me on his own phone. He said he'd intercepted it because he thought it was a mistake, because he couldn't believe you'd actually—" She stopped. He looked devastated. He looked like it was destroying him to tell me. Tae-hyun thought about Min-kyu's face at the funeral, the devastation on it, the specific texture of that grief. He had believed it completely. He had taken it as evidence that Min-kyu was suffering the same loss he was, that his oldest friend understood what had been taken from him. He had leaned on that shared devastation in the weeks afterward, had allowed Min-kyu to take more operational control while he himself had moved through those early months like something gutted and re-sewn with inferior thread. The calculation was beautiful in the way that terrible things can be beautiful when they are perfectly made. Give Amara a reason to run, stage an explosion, close the casket, let Tae-hyun's grief transform him. Because Min-kyu had known what grief would do to him, had known him long enough to know that he would not go quiet and soft, that he would go in exactly the other direction, that he would become exactly the kind of devastating, uncontrollable weapon that a man with territorial ambitions could point at rival factions while quietly consolidating power behind him. "I didn't send that message," Tae-hyun said. "I know you're going to say that. I know." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking you to believe it on my word. I'm asking you to stay alive long enough for me to prove it." She looked at him. The wetness on her face was not entirely rain. "He took everything from both of us," Tae-hyun said. 6 months, He stopped. Something in his throat was closing in a way that he hadn't had to manage in a long time, because the machinery he'd built to deal with grief had been constructed for a grief that was supposed to be permanent, and it was not equipped for this. 6 months of believing you were gone, 6 months of everything I did after. He looked at his hands. "I need you to understand what those 6 months were, Amara. I need you to understand what I became. And I'm not asking your forgiveness for it. I'm telling you what Min-kyu built. He needed a monster, and he made one. He used your death to make one. And now we're both loose from the story he built, and he's going to—" His phone, secured in an inner pocket, vibrated once. He pulled it out. A message from a number he didn't recognize. One of the relay codes his organization used for secure communication when primary channels were compromised. "You down. 2 others gone. 4 hostiles neutralized at the diner. Message relayed via Sector 3. Seo Min-kyu has activated Protocol 7 across all districts. Official communication. Kang Tae-hyun is declared compromised. Orders authorized to neutralize on site. This message will not repeat." Tae-hyun read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the cabinet beside him. Protocol 7. He had written Protocol 7 himself years ago as a contingency for exactly one scenario. A sitting leader of the organization who had been determined by sufficient consensus to be a threat to the organization's survival. It required the authorization of the second-in-command plus 2 senior captains. He had never imagined it being used against him. He had certainly never imagined Min-Kyu having the leverage to pull two senior captains across the line. But then, Min-Kyu had had 6 months to work on them. He looked at Amara. "Things have changed," he said. "Changed how?" "I've just been declared an enemy of my own organization." He said it with the flatness of a man delivering a weather report. "Which means every man who works for me, who used to work for me, now has authorization and incentive to put a bullet in me." Amara stared at him. "And you," he continued, "if Min-Kyu knows you're alive, and those men at the diner were not looking for me specifically, which means they were looking for you first, then he knows the story he built is collapsing, which means he needs to end it cleanly, both of us." "He wants to kill our child," Amara said. She said it quietly, matter-of-factly, the way you say a thing that you have already lived with for long enough that the horror of it has become simply the texture of your situation. Taehyun looked at her stomach, at the curve of her, at the life inside her that had been navigating this world for 7 months without knowing, without having any choice in the matter, without a single thing being asked of it except to survive. He felt something move in him that the 6 months of machinery hadn't touched, something older than the machinery, something that the grief and the rage and the transformation had buried under enough layers that he'd assumed it was gone. It wasn't gone. "No," he said. The word came out low and absolute. He doesn't get that. Outside, somewhere in the direction they'd come from, a sound moved through the storm. Not gunfire, but something heavier. An explosion. Secondary, controlled. The kind of sound a burning vehicle makes when the fuel catches. His convoy, his men. He closed his eyes for one breath, 2. Then he opened them. "There's a secondary radio in that cabinet," he said. "Encrypted, short range. I need to find out who in the organization is still—" He stopped. Amara had made a sound, not pain, something more complicated than pain, something caught halfway between pain and shock, and she had gone very still on the cot with both hands pressed low against her stomach, and her face doing something he'd never seen her face do before. "Amara, it's early," she said. Her voice was extremely controlled in a way that indicated she was using everything available to her to keep it that way. "It's 3 weeks early." He crossed the room. He knelt in front of her and she let him. She had gone past the point of maintaining distance, past whatever walls she'd been holding between them, because something more immediate than their history or his guilt or her fear had arrived and was making its own demands. "How early is a contraction starting?" he said. She looked at him. "Right now," she said, and somewhere across the city, in a glass and steel office building with a view of the Han River, Seo Min-Kyu was reading the same report Tae-hyun had just received. The confirmation that Amara Okoye was alive, that the plan had fractured, that the king he'd spent 6 months building into a perfect weapon was now loose and armed and fully aware of who had aimed him. And Min-Kyu was reaching for his phone with the calmness of a man who had always had a contingency for this too. The first contraction lasted 40 seconds. Taehyun counted them without meaning to. The way his mind had always measured things, automatically, compulsively. Because in his world, the difference between 40 seconds and 60 seconds was often the difference between alive and not. He knelt on the concrete floor in front of her and watched her face move through the contraction with the specific controlled endurance of a woman who had been managing pain alone for long enough that she no longer reached for anyone when it came. She breathed through her nose. Her hand stayed flat on her stomach. She didn't make a sound. When it passed, she let out a single long exhale through her mouth. "How far apart?" he said. "That was the second one. The first was about 20 minutes ago in the kitchen, before—" She stopped. "Before the window came in." "So you were already in labor during the firefight." "I wasn't sure yet. You can have contractions earlier than this, and it doesn't mean—" "Amara." "I know," she said. She said it the way you say a thing you've been arguing against in your own head for 20 minutes and have finally lost the argument. "I know what it means." He stood. The cabinet against the wall held the first aid kit, the radio, the gun. He opened it and moved the gun to his waistband without thinking about it, the same way you put on shoes, procedural, automatic, and pulled the radio out and the first aid kit and set them both on the edge of the cot beside her. "The kit has basics," he said. "Clean towels, cord clamp, antiseptic. Whoever stocked it was thinking about gunshot wounds, but it's enough for For delivering a baby in a concrete room in the middle of the night during a Mafia war, she said. Yes. Great, she said, and the word came out flat and almost without effect, and it was the closest thing to dark humor he'd heard from her, and it knocked something loose in him that he hadn't expected. He sat on the edge of the cot, not close enough to crowd her. Close enough. Tell me about the last 6 months, he said. From the beginning. I need to know everything, and we may not have much time before the next contraction or before someone finds us. Either. She looked at the wall opposite. Her jaw moved slightly. She was sorting something, deciding how much, in what order, with what degree of emotional protection around the parts that cost the most to say. Minkyu came to me the morning of the day I disappeared, she said. I was at the apartment in Mapo. You were in Busan for the Lim faction meeting. You'd been gone 2 days. He came alone. No security. Which I thought was strange, but She pressed her lips together. I trusted him. He'd always been decent to me. He was the one who told me when we first got together that not everyone in your organization was happy about it, about me, and that I should come to him if I ever felt unsafe. He said that like he was offering protection. I believed him. Taehyun said nothing. He was listening the way he listened in interrogations. Total, absolute, giving nothing back that would interfere with the flow of what was coming out. He showed me the phone. The message was timestamped 3 days earlier, which put it during the Busan trip. The header had your cipher prefix, the one you use for operational communications. I'd seen it before on messages you left open by accident. It said, she stopped, looked at her hands. It said, remove the liability, clean disposal, no trace. She swallowed. And then your number. And then a location, our apartment building. Remove the liability. He had never used that phrase in his life. Minkyu knew that. Minkyu had known him long enough to know exactly what language he would not use, which meant Minkyu had also known that Amara didn't know that she'd been on the periphery of his operational world long enough to recognize the format, but not long enough to know the specific texture of how he actually communicated within it. He told me I had an hour, Amara continued. He said he'd intercepted it and delayed the men who were sent, but that he couldn't hold them longer than that without raising suspicion. He said he'd arranged a car. He gave me cash, a lot of cash, which I understand now was to make the story complete, to make sure I actually ran and kept running. And he looked, she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked like a man who was suffering. He looked like it was costing him something real. I have replayed that moment so many times in 6 months, and I still cannot find the performance in it. He was that good. He's had practice, Taehyun said. He's been performing for me for 11 years. She looked at him then. First time she'd looked at him directly in more than a minute. I went to the car, she said. I had 20 minutes. I took almost nothing. My passport, the cash, the burner he gave me. I was 8 blocks away when I heard the explosion behind me. I looked back, and the building, our floor specifically, where I would have been, was burning. She touched her stomach. One slow gesture. And I thought that was it. That was confirmation. And I ran. The radio on the cot crackled once and went silent. Taehyun picked it up. He ran through the frequency sequence, a specific set of channels that he'd assigned to a small number of people who were not officially part of his organization, but who worked adjacent to it. People who survived in this world by maintaining careful neutrality, who answered to no one, who he had cultivated over years with the specific patience of someone who understood that the most valuable resource in a conflict is the person nobody knows, you know. On the 3rd channel, after 11 seconds of static, someone answered. Took you longer than I expected, the voice said. A woman's voice, older, dry, with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who was not surprised by things. I had complications, Taehyun said. I've heard. Protocol 7 is all over the district comms. You've had a busy night. A pause. You're alive. That already contradicts about 40% of what's being said right now. I need a medical contact. Someone discreet. Someone who doesn't run back to the syndicate. Not a hospital. A beat of silence. How bad? Premature labor? 3 weeks early, 2 contractions, 20 minutes apart. Another beat. Longer. There's a woman in Dobong-gu, the voice said. Her name was Oh Seon-hwa before she changed it. She delivered babies in the camps outside Kaesong for 6 years before she came south. She owes me something that I've never collected. I'll call it in now. How far are you from the Nowon district line? 20 minutes on foot. Less if I find a vehicle. Find a vehicle. I'll send the address to this frequency in 10 minutes. And Taehyun. Another pause. Min-kyu has already contacted the Busan bloc. He's offering them expanded port access in exchange for support of the leadership transition. 2 of your senior captains have already publicly confirmed their support. This is moving fast. How many haven't confirmed? 4 that I know of, possibly 5. But they're not speaking publicly. They're waiting to see which way it falls. Everything falls the way it's pushed, Taehyun said. He clicked off. Amara was watching him. Who was that? She said. Someone who lives between things. She's useful precisely because she doesn't exist in anyone's records. He looked at the door, then back at her. There's a doctor about 20 minutes from here who can help you. I need to get us a vehicle. You're going out there. The lot behind this building has a maintenance truck. It won't be locked. How do you know? Because I own the building and I don't lock maintenance trucks. It slows down access in an emergency. He stood, checked the Glock in his waistband. I'll be 4 minutes. Taehyun. He stopped at the door. She hadn't moved from the cot. Her face was doing the complicated thing again. The thing where multiple things were running at once, and none of them were winning. The things you said, about what you became, after. He waited. I don't know who you are right now, she said. I know who you were when I left. I know who I was afraid you had always been, the version Min-kyu showed me. And I know what you just did in that diner, which is... She stopped. I don't know how to hold all 3 of those things at once. You don't have to, he said. Not tonight. Don't tell me what I have to do tonight. Fair, he said. He went out the door. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had intensified in the last hour, becoming the kind of sustained downpour that removes the distinction between rain and just being underwater. Every surface ran with it. Every gap between buildings channeled it into impromptu rivers that crossed the service roads in dark moving sheets. Taehyun moved along the rear of the building with his back to the wall, staying out of the light, which was minimal here, a single amber security light at the far corner that provided just enough visibility to navigate and just enough shadow to hide in. The maintenance area was a gated enclosure at the building's northeast corner. The gate was a simple sliding mechanism, chain link, secured with a combination lock that he hadn't thought about in 4 years, but whose code, a 5-digit number that was the date Amara told him she loved him for the first time, he still knew without having to search for it. He hadn't chosen that number consciously. He'd discovered it after the fact, the same way you discover things about yourself that you've apparently always known but haven't looked at directly. He opened the gate and found the truck, a gray panel van, the kind that belongs to no particular story because it's too generic to occupy one. Keys in the cabin, magnetic case above the wheel well. He started it without the lights and let it roll forward to the gate, then stopped and went back and relocked the combination lock, replacing it the way he'd found it. Old habit, leave no evidence of passage. Even tonight, even with everything collapsing around him, the discipline held. He was back inside with Amara in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She was standing when he came in. Another contraction had hit while he was gone. He could see it in the way she was holding herself, in the faint sheen on her upper lip that hadn't been there before, in the controlled deliberateness of her breathing as the tail end of it passed. She hadn't said anything. She'd gotten through it alone, the way she'd been getting through everything for 6 months. He hated that. He registered the hatred specifically as a distinct and particular feeling separate from everything else, because it was the first emotion in 6 months that was not grief or rage, or the cold operational nothingness that had replaced them. It was something more personal than those, more specific. Let's go, she said. The drive to Dobonggu took 19 minutes. Taehyun kept the truck under the speed limit and ran no lights he didn't have to run, staying on the secondary roads that he knew like the pattern of his own hand. 3 times he deviated from the most direct route, once because a police checkpoint was visible 3 blocks ahead. Once because a black SUV sitting at a corner had the specific stillness of a vehicle that was watching rather than parking. Once because of something he couldn't name, just a quality in the approach to an intersection that felt wrong in a way he'd learned over many years to not dismiss. Amara sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving across the city they were passing through. She'd grown up in Chicago, had come to Seoul for a humanitarian policy position with an international organization, and had spent 3 years learning this city from the outside before she met him, and then learning it from a different angle entirely. He wondered, watching her peripherally while he drove, what she was seeing in it tonight, whether it looked like the city she'd learned or something else. Min-kyu was always kind to me, she said. Not to him, particularly, more to the window, to the city going past. I used to think it was because he genuinely... She stopped. I thought he saw me as a person, not as your wife, not as the complication, as a person. He probably did, Tae-hyun said. That doesn't change what he did. No. She was quiet for a moment. It makes it worse. Another contraction came at a red light, the fourth one now, and she breathed through it with her hand pressed flat to the window glass and her eyes closed. And Tae-hyun sat at the red light and watched his own hands on the steering wheel and did not go through the red light, because going through red lights attracted attention, and attention got you dead, and he was not going to get them dead. Not tonight, not with her sitting next to him, not with... The light changed. He drove. The address on the radio frequency resolved to a narrow residential building on a side street in Dobong-gu, the kind of building that looked like it had been built in one decade and maintained in another with complete indifference to the aesthetic differences between them. Third floor, the message had said. Door will be open. The door was open. The woman inside was somewhere in her 60s, small and compact, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have seen a great deal and have finished being startled by it. She looked at Amara for approximately 3 seconds, then at Tae-hyun for 1, then back at Amara. How far apart? She said. 15 minutes now, Amara said. Maybe less. Come. The apartment was small and very clean and smelled like medicinal soap and something herbal that Tae-hyun couldn't identify. The woman, who gave no name and who Tae-hyun did not ask for, moved with the efficiency of someone who had converted domestic space into medical space many times before and knew exactly which furniture needed to move and in what direction. She had Amara positioned on the prepared surface in the back room within 4 minutes, her hands already moving with the confident deliberateness of clinical competence, speaking to Amara in low, even sentences. Tae-hyun stayed in the outer room. He stood at the window that looked out onto the street below, keeping back from the glass, watching the parked cars, the line of buildings opposite, the gap at the end of the street that opened onto the larger road. He could hear Amara's voice through the wall, occasionally, answering questions. He could hear the woman's voice responding. He couldn't make out the words, and he didn't try to. He picked up the radio. I need to reach the 4 captains who haven't committed, he said on the frequency. The response came back after a short delay. I can get a message to 2 of them. The other 2, I'm not certain where they are and I'm not willing to go looking tonight. 2 is enough to start. He kept his eyes on the street below. Tell them Protocol 7 was invoked on false grounds. Tell them I'm alive and that Seo Min-kyu staged the death of my wife 6 months ago to manipulate a leadership transition. Tell them I'm requesting a suspended action. 24 hours, no sides, until I can provide proof. Proof of what, specifically? The forged message. Min-kyu had to have used a technical specialist to replicate my cipher prefix. That kind of work leaves traces. I know who in Seoul does that level of forgery, and there are exactly 3 of them. And Min-kyu would have used the one called Bae Sung-il, because Bae is the only one who can do the encryption mimicry at that level. Bae keeps records. He keeps records because records are leverage, and leverage is money, and he doesn't trust anyone enough to operate without insurance against them. But, so you want the captains to sit on their hands for 24 hours while you go find a forger? While I go find the forger's records? Yes. A pause. That's a thin thread to hang a counterclaim on. It's the thread I have. He clicked off. Through the wall, Amara made a sound, controlled, effortful, and then went quiet again. He put his hand flat against the wall without thinking about it and then removed it. He thought about the 6 months, specifically about the first 3 weeks of them, before the grief had gone cold and been replaced by the machinery. The 3 weeks when he'd still been something raw and alive and completely unmade. He had not been good during those 3 weeks. He turned the word over carefully in his mind and found no adequate alternative, catastrophic. He had done things in that period that he could not attribute to discipline or strategy or any of the other frameworks he normally used to understand his own actions. He had simply been catastrophic in the manner of a natural disaster, undirected, total, indifferent to specific targets in the way that real devastation is always indifferent. And Min-kyu had watched all of it, had managed it, carefully, from close range, redirecting the worst of it toward rival factions that he wanted cleared, keeping Tae-hyun operational in the ways that served his consolidation, and slowly, methodically, inserting himself into the structural positions that Tae-hyun had vacated in his grief. The patience of it, the architecture of it. 11 years of friendship as the foundation for a betrayal that required 11 years of observation to make possible. Tae-hyun had asked himself many times during those 6 months whether he had made Amara a target by bringing her into his world. He had never been able to answer that cleanly. The honest answer was yes. Her proximity to him had always carried risk, and he had managed that risk as well as it could be managed, but the risk had always been real, and he had chosen to let her stay close anyway, because the alternative was losing her to distance rather than danger, and he had not been able to make that choice. What he had not asked himself, because it had not been a question he knew to ask, was whether the danger was inside the house rather than outside it. The radio crackled. "Message delivered to Captain Yoon," the woman's voice said. He acknowledged. His response was, "Tell him I'm listening, but the clock is already running." And the other? "Captain Han has gone dark. I can't reach him," which either means he's already committed to Min-kyu's side or he's waiting somewhere quiet and doesn't want to be found until he decides which way to move. Either way, he's not a variable I can count on tonight. No, Tae-hyun thought. One captain who was listening, 3 who had publicly backed Min-kyu, 1 unknown. The math was not favorable, but it wasn't closed. Organizations didn't run on votes. They ran on leverage and fear and the particular momentum of whoever appeared to be winning. If he could fracture Min-kyu's narrative before it fully solidified, if he could produce Bae Sung-il's records and put the forgery on record in front of enough of the organization's senior structure, the political calculus would shift. Not because those men cared about justice, they didn't, but because they cared about being on the right side of what was coming, and right now they didn't know which side that was. The door to the back room opened. The woman who had given no name appeared in the doorway. Her expression was the professional composure of someone who delivers news this way, with the face ahead of the words, letting you read the broad shape before the specifics arrive. "She's progressing quickly," the woman said. "The baby is in good position. There are no signs of distress." She looked at him with an appraising quality, not warm, not hostile, just accurate. "But she is asking for you." Tae-hyun looked at the door. "She specifically said?" he asked. "She specifically said." The woman stepped aside. "She also said to tell you she's still angry, so don't make assumptions." He went in. The room was small and lit with 2 lamps, and the air in it was warm in a way the rest of the apartment hadn't been. Amara was propped against the headboard, covered with a sheet, her hair pulled back now, and her face carrying the specific expression of someone in the active middle of something large and physical and involuntary. She looked at him when he came in, and she didn't say anything for a moment. He sat in the chair that had been positioned next to the bed. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, close enough, and he looked at her. "You don't have to hold my hand," she said. "I know. You don't have to say anything." "I know." She held his gaze for a moment. Another contraction was building. He could see it in the shift of her breath, the slight tension moving through her. And he watched her meet it, watched her use everything she had to stay inside it rather than run from it. And he thought that this was what she'd always been, underneath the warmth and the humor and the specific brightness she'd always carried, this core of hard and unbreakable material that she'd never had occasion to fully show him before 6 months forced her to find it. She reached out and took his hand. She didn't look at him when she did it. She looked straight ahead, and her hand found his and closed around 2 of his fingers and held on, and he let her hold whatever she needed. "If something goes wrong," she said, through the contraction, "you take him somewhere they can't find him. Not Seoul, not anywhere in your world. Promise me." "Nothing is going to—" "Promise me." "I promise," he said. The contraction passed. She was quiet for a long moment, catching her breath. The lamp beside the bed threw warm light across her face, and he looked at it. At the specific geography of her, the lines that were new since the last time he'd been this close, the evidence of 6 months written into her in ways that only proximity could reveal. And he felt something that he had no adequate name for, something that sat in the space between grief and gratitude, and something fiercer than either. "I thought about you every day," she said. "Even when I was afraid of you. Even when I was certain you'd sent them." She paused. "I kept having this argument with myself where part of me was saying, you know him, you know what he is, he wouldn't. And the other part was saying the message, you saw the message, you saw his number, what else could it mean? And the second part kept winning because the message was there and you weren't, and I had no way to—" She stopped. "I had no way to ask you." "I know," he said. "I named him," she said. The shift in subject was so abrupt that it took him a moment to follow it. "Already?" he said. "I had 6 months and nothing to do but move and hide and think." A breath that was almost a laugh. "I named him Jay, Kang Jay." She looked at him sideways. "Is that— do you have something you wanted to—" "No," he said. "Jay is good." She looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't exactly softness, but was something adjacent to it. Something that had survived 6 months of fear and running and being alone, that had survived the most efficient demolition Min-Kyu had been able to construct, and had come out the other side smaller, maybe, quieter, but still present. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Not what you think I want to hear, the things you did after. How bad?" He sat with the question. He could have given her the version that acknowledged the broad shape without the detail, the version that a careful man gives to protect the other person from the full weight of what he's capable of. He had given that version to people before. He was good at it. He looked at her hand, still holding 2 of his fingers. "Bad," he said. "Worse than anything I'd done before. I had nothing to lose and I operated that way." She nodded slowly, not forgiving it, not dismissing it, just receiving it. "Are those things going to follow us?" she said. "Some of them will." "Then we need to be somewhere they can't reach." "After tonight," he said. "After I—" His phone moved in his pocket. Not a call, a message, pulsed through the relay frequency and decoded on the device. He read it, and something in his face must have moved because Amara straightened against the headboard. "What?" she said. He turned the phone so she could read it. The message was from a number associated with Min-Kyu's personal security apparatus. A number that Tae-hyun knew because he had assigned it himself 3 years ago when he had restructured the organization's communication security. It had been sent not to him, but broadcast across the syndicate's internal network, which meant his relay had intercepted it rather than received it directly, which meant Min-Kyu had not intended him to see it and had not known that he still had access to the network's broadcast layer through the relay. The message read, "Locate and neutralize both targets. Leave no evidence of the child, no loose ends, no evidence of the child." Amara read it twice. Her face went through something that moved too fast to track and settled on something cold and very clear. The woman who had given no name appeared in the doorway and looked at Amara and then at Tae-hyun and then at the phone in his hand. She didn't ask. She could read rooms. "How long?" Tae-hyun said. "An hour," the woman said. "Perhaps less." "She's moving fast." 1 hour. Possibly less. He had 1 hour in this room, in this chair, before he would need to move them again. And now he was moving a woman in active labor and a newborn through a city where every channel of the organization he'd spent 11 years building had been turned against him by the man he'd trusted most. He had one captain who was listening and one unknown and no physical proof of anything, and Min-Kyu had just explicitly ordered the death of a child who had not yet drawn his first breath. Tae-hyun set the phone face down on his knee. He looked at Amara. She was looking back at him with the particular expression of a woman who has already done the math and arrived at the same place he has and is not asking him to make it better or softer or less than what it is. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He nodded. He picked up the radio. Whatever was left of the life he'd built, the organization, the territory, the architecture of power that had taken 11 years to construct, he was going to take it apart himself, piece by piece, and use the pieces to end this. Not to keep it, not to reclaim it, to end it. He brought the radio to his mouth. And in a glass and steel building on the south side of the Han River, Seo Min-kyu was sitting behind the desk that used to belong to Tae-hyun, in the chair that used to belong to Tae-hyun, looking at a live feed from a drone that his technical team had deployed over the Dobong-gu district. The drone found them 11 minutes later. Tae-hyun saw it first. A slight movement against the wet black sky outside the window, too steady to be debris in the wind, too deliberate to be anything except what it was. A small commercial frame, modified, the kind of platform that his own technical team used for close urban surveillance. He recognized the flight pattern. He had written the flight pattern. He was already moving before he'd fully processed the sight of it. "We need to go," he said. The woman with no name looked up from where she was positioned at the foot of the bed. "She cannot be moved right now," the woman said. Not a suggestion, a clinical statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to having that statement ignored by people with guns. "How long?" Tae-hyun said. "The baby is crowning." He looked at Amara. She was past the point of the conversation, past language, past anything except the enormous physical work that had taken over her body completely. She was doing it the way she'd done everything tonight, with the focused totality of someone who has no alternative and has made peace with that. He stepped back from the window. He killed both lamps. The room went dark except for the ambient light from the street below, which was minimal and orange and just sufficient to navigate by. "Do you need to see what you're doing?" he said to the woman. "I've done this in worse dark than this," she said. He positioned himself at the window, flat against the wall, watching the drone through the glass. It was holding a position above the intersection 2 buildings south, close enough for thermal imaging, which meant it had already found them. The question was not whether Min-kyu's people knew their location. The question was how long before ground units arrived to act on what the drone was showing them. He calculated. Drone deployment from a vehicle would take 3 to 5 minutes to position. Ground units in this district. He thought about Min-kyu's operational footprint in Dobong-gu, which was limited, which was why he'd chosen the district in the first place. 20 minutes minimum for a serious response team. 15 if they'd already staged someone nearby. He had 15 minutes in the best case. He brought the radio up. "I need Bae Sung-il's location," he said on the frequency. The response came back in less than a minute. "Bae moved his operation 8 months ago. He's in Jungnang-gu now, above the dry cleaning business on Mangu Row. He runs a rotating schedule. He's at the location Tuesday, Thursday, and alternating Saturdays. Tonight is Thursday." Tonight was Thursday. "Is he alone?" "Bae is never alone. He keeps 2 men with him since the Huang incident last year, but they're not your organization's people. They're freelance, which means their loyalty ends at the edge of whatever Bae is paying them." Tae-hyun clicked off. He looked at the window. The drone had moved, repositioning slightly north, which meant it had confirmed thermal signatures and was now painting the location for a ground team to navigate to. From the bed, a sound. A sound that was not pain and not fear, but something much more fundamental than either. Something that existed below both of those categories at the level of pure biological event. And then the woman with no name saying something low and certain, and then a silence of about 4 seconds that was the specific silence of a transition, of something crossing from one state into another. And then a small sound, new, specific, unmistakable. Tae-hyun did not move from the window. He could not afford to move from the window. He stood with his back flat against the wall and his eyes on the drone in the sky and his hand tight on the radio, and he breathed once, carefully, through his nose. Kang Jae had arrived. The woman worked efficiently in the dark. She said the things that needed to be said to Amara in a low, continuous voice and did the things that needed to be done, and 4 minutes later she appeared at Tae-hyun's shoulder. And when he turned, she was holding a small wrapped form that was making a sound like an argument in a language that had not yet developed words. "Healthy," the woman said. "Small, but healthy. His lungs are clear." Tae-hyun looked at the thing in her arms. He had no framework for this moment. He had prepared in his mind for many kinds of moments over his life. Moments of violence, of negotiation, of loss, of the particular cold clarity that descends when a decision has to be made that cannot be undone. He had not prepared for this. He didn't think preparation was possible for this. He reached out one hand and touched the side of the small face with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers that Amara had held onto through the contractions, and the face turned toward the touch with the blind, instinctive certainty of something that had been alive for less than 10 minutes and already knew what it needed. "We have 10 minutes," he said to the woman. "Maybe less. Can she move?" "Not easily, but the alternative is worse." He went to Amara. She was exhausted in a way that went past what he had words for. A specific quality of depletion that was not weakness, but the aftermath of something that had taken everything and left the essential core behind, like burning down to the grain of the wood. She looked at him when he came close, and then past him at the small wrapped thing the woman was bringing, and the expression on her face was the one thing he'd seen tonight that he couldn't look at for too long. "I know," he said. "I know we have to move. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," she said. Her voice was wrecked and steady at the same time. "Just make sure we get somewhere." He helped her up. The woman organized what could be organized in 2 minutes, took what was essential, left everything else. They moved out of the apartment and down the building's back stairwell, which was unlit and smelled like old concrete and mildew, and the particular cold that staircases hold even in autumn. Tae-hyun went first, then Amara, with her hand on the wall and her jaw set, then the woman carrying Jae, and not speaking. The truck was where he'd left it on the side street. He got them inside, Amara in the back where she could lie across the seat, the woman beside her, Jae between them wrapped in everything available, and he got in front and he drove. He drove north, away from the drone's last position, taking the route that stayed under the heaviest tree cover and away from the main arteries. His mind was running 2 tracks simultaneously in the way it always ran when things had narrowed to their worst. One track on the immediate navigation, the other on the larger problem. Ba Sung-il, Jungnang-gu, above the dry cleaning business on Mangu Row. The forger kept records. The records would show the commission, the date, the technical specifications of the cipher replication, possibly a chain of payment that could be traced back to Min-kyu's operational accounts. It wasn't courtroom evidence. It didn't need to be. It needed to be enough to put in front of Captain Yoon and make the case that Protocol 7 had been invoked fraudulently, that the man currently sitting behind Tae-hyun's desk had built his leadership on a fabricated assassination order and a staged death. It needed to be enough to crack the consensus. He had to get Amara and Jae somewhere static first, somewhere Min-kyu's drone hadn't been, and where it would take time to find them. He thought about the network of properties, how many of them Min-kyu now had access to through the organization's asset records, how many of them he might not know about, which ones had been acquired through channels that existed outside the official ledger. There was one, a property in the Yongnam-gu district, which was either a perfect coincidence or the kind of thing that happens when you're running on 15 minutes of planning and no sleep, that he'd acquired 7 years ago through a real estate shell that even his own financial people didn't have a complete record of, because he'd structured it that way intentionally, because he'd been building a specific kind of insurance for a specific kind of moment and had not known, at the time, what kind of moment it would turn out to be. He drove to it. It was a 3-story building on a residential street, unremarkable from outside, maintained by a property manager who knew nothing about who owned it and had been paid not to be curious. Ground floor was a storage space. Second floor, 2 apartments. Third floor, 1. He got them to the 3rd floor. He got Amara onto the bed that was still made up from the last time the apartment had been used, which was 2 years ago. And he got Jae settled beside her, and he stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the 2 of them and held that sight for approximately 3 seconds, which was all the time he had, and then he looked at the woman with no name. "Can you stay with them?" It wasn't a question. "I can stay," she said. "Your contact." "I'll call in a second debt," the woman said dryly. "I apparently have them to spare." He looked at Amara one more time. She was holding Jae against her with the concentrated attention of someone whose body knew exactly what it was doing, even when the rest of her circumstances were completely insane. And she looked up at him with the expression that was not soft, but was not the expression she'd had in the diner either, the expression that was something in between that he didn't have a name for yet. "Go," she said. He went. The dry cleaning business on Mangu Row was closed at this hour, its front window dark, a hand-lettered sign in the glass. The building above it was a converted residential space, 3 units per floor, external staircase on the east side. Tae-hyun parked the truck 2 streets away and covered the distance on foot, staying in the shadows cast by the building's overhangs against the rain, which had finally begun to ease. No longer the sustained hammer of earlier, now an intermittent dripping from gutters and eaves that sounded like someone thinking out loud. He took the external staircase 2 steps at a time, quiet, hand on the rail to manage the noise of his weight on the metal. Second floor, third floor. The door at the top of the staircase was a heavy-duty steel frame unit that had no business being at the top of a residential staircase and therefore told him exactly what was on the other side of it. He knocked. A silence of about 8 seconds. Then a voice from close behind the door. Someone who had come to it without footsteps, which meant they'd been near it already, which meant they'd seen him coming on whatever camera fed the interior monitor. "You have the wrong building," the voice said. "Tell Bae that Kang Tae-hyun is outside his door," Tae-hyun said. "Tell him I'm alone and I have a proposition, and if he makes me stand in the rain to deliver it, I'll be considerably less polite about how I present it." Another silence. Longer. The door opened. The man behind it was not Bae. He was one of the freelance security, broad and flat-faced with the particular physical quality of someone hired for their capacity to occupy space. He stepped back without speaking, and Tae-hyun went in. The interior of Bae Sung-il's working space was the kind of organized chaos that only makes sense to the person who built it. 3 monitors arranged in a curve above a central desk, hard drives stacked in labeled towers along one wall, a secondary workstation in the corner covered with physical documents under acetate, and the persistent ambient smell of equipment that ran hot. The second security man was positioned near the secondary workstation, his hand visible and his intent legible. Bae Sung-il himself was sitting at the central desk. He was small and thin and somewhere in his mid-50s, with the specific pallor of someone who spent most of his life under artificial light by choice, and he was looking at Tae-hyun with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and not quite achieving it. "You're supposed to be under Protocol 7, Bae said. "Hey, I'm aware of what I'm supposed to be," Tae-hyun said. 8 months ago, someone commissioned a piece of work from you. Encryption mimicry of a private cipher. Replication of a specific phone number's header format. The output was a fabricated message that was used to drive a woman out of Seoul and stage her disappearance. Bae's expression remained technically neutral. "I work on a lot of projects," he said. "You work on 3 classes of project," Tae-hyun said. "Document forgery, communication intercept, and cipher replication. There are 2 other people in Seoul who work at your level, and neither of them could have executed the cipher mimicry on this specific commission because one of them doesn't handle Korean syndicate encryption formats and the other one has been in Jeju for 7 months. So it was you." Interesting theory. It's not a theory. I built the cipher. I know what it takes to replicate it. I know it's possible, and I know you're the only one who could have done it in the time frame. Tae-hyun moved to the desk and put both hands flat on its surface and looked at Bae from close range. "I also know you keep records. You keep records because you're not stupid, and because the people who commission your work are the kind of people who might benefit from denying the commission later, and you have no interest in being a loose end." Bae's jaw moved slightly. "What I'm offering you," Tae-hyun said, "is a clean exit from this specific situation. You give me the record of the commission, payment chain, communication logs, technical specifications, whatever you have, and in exchange I have no further interest in you or this room or anything in it. You disappear before tomorrow morning and we never had this conversation. And if I don't, then Min-kyu finds out I came here, which he will regardless, and he draws his own conclusions about what you told me, and he's considerably less interested in your continued existence than I am because you're only useful to me as a witness and you're only a liability to him." Bae looked at the desk surface between Tae-hyun's hands. He looked at the 2 security men in the way you look at things that you're trying to calculate the value of and finding the number insufficient. "The commission came through 3 intermediaries," Bae said. "I don't take direct contact for this class of work. I know how you work." The final intermediary was a man named Park Ji-hwan. He's been on Seo Min-kyu's support staff for 6 years. I have the communication log. I have the payment routing. I have the technical record of the replication work, including the source cipher elements that were provided to me as a reference. Tae-hyun straightened. Where? He said. Bae reached under the desk, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who understood what reaches under desks can look like to armed people, and produced a flat external drive in a matte black casing. Copy is already prepared, Bae said. I made it 2 days ago when I heard about Protocol 7 and started thinking about contingencies. He set it on the desk. I'm not a fool, Kang. I knew this would surface eventually. Tae-hyun picked up the drive. Leave Seoul tonight, he said. Already planned, Bae said. Tae-hyun turned for the door. The security man nearest the exit moved. Not to stop him, but to open the door, which was the most professionally neutral exit facilitation Tae-hyun had experienced in a long evening of much less pleasant interactions. He went back down the staircase and into the street and stood for a moment with the rain coming down light and cold on the back of his neck, holding the drive in his hand. He had the record. He had the chain. He had the thing that turned a claim into a case. He brought the radio up. I have what I need, he said on the frequency. Get me an emergency channel to Captain Yoon. The response came back immediately. Already attempted. Yoon went dark 40 minutes ago. A pause that had a texture to it. Tae-hyun, Min-kyu made an announcement to the full senior structure 20 minutes ago. He's claiming you've been located and neutralized. He's saying the information came from a confirmed field team. Tae-hyun stood in the rain. He's saying I'm dead. Yes. Which means anyone who is sitting on the fence just got the answer to which way to fall. The Busan bloc formally committed to his leadership 8 minutes ago. Captain Han has gone public with his support. Another pause. Captain Yoon hasn't responded to the announcement. His silence might mean something, but the structure is consolidating around Min-kyu faster than... I need to make contact with the senior structure directly, Tae-hyun said. Not through intermediaries. I need to get the drive in front of enough people that Min-kyu can't suppress it. How? He thought. He thought about the architecture of the organization, where it gathered, where its senior elements physically existed in the same space at the same time, where he could appear in front of them in a way that couldn't be filtered through Min-kyu's communication control. There was one location. There was one standing protocol that brought the senior structure together on a fixed schedule that couldn't be altered without signaling internal crisis. A protocol that Min-kyu himself would be present for, because canceling it now would look like exactly the kind of instability that consolidated leaderships could not afford to project. The Thursday Standing Review. It happened at 4 a.m., every Thursday, at a location in the Yeongdeungpo district that the organization had used for 7 years. Security sweep at 3:30. Senior captains confirmed present by 3:45. It was now 2:17 a.m. He had 73 minutes. He was already moving toward the truck. He was 3 blocks from where he'd parked when the call came through on the relay. Not a message, an actual voice call, which the relay almost never carried, which meant whoever was calling had overridden the normal protocol to get through. He answered. The voice on the other end was not one he expected. Tae-hyun, the voice said, you need to stop moving right now. It was Captain Yoon. Tae-hyun stopped moving. You're alive, Yoon said. I knew it as soon as he made the announcement. He made it too fast, too clean. There was no confirmation lag, no field team debrief, no... It had the shape of a story, not a report. I have proof of the forgery, Tae-hyun said. The message that drove my wife out of Seoul. I have the commission record, the payment chain, everything. I need to get in front of the senior structure before... That's what I'm calling about. A pause that Tae-hyun did not like the texture of. The Thursday review has been moved. When? 2 hours ago. Min-kyu moved it to the Yeouido location. New venue, new security protocol. Nobody outside his confirmed inner circle knows the address. Another pause. But that's not the part you need to hear. Tae-hyun waited. The woman, Yoon said, your wife. Min-kyu has a man inside the Dobong-gu district who flagged the drone footage before you moved them. He doesn't have their current location, but he has a 20-minute radius from the drone's last confirmed thermal. He's running a grid search right now with 4 teams. Tae-hyun's body went very still. How long ago? He said. The search started 18 minutes ago. 18 minutes? a 20-minute radius grid search with 4 teams. He had moved them from Dobonggu to Jongnanggu. Adjacent districts, the move had taken 9 minutes, which put the new location inside the outer edge of the search radius, depending on exactly where Min-Kyu's man was anchoring the grid. He was already running. "There's something else," Yoon said, and the something else in his voice had a specific weight that made Tae-hyun slow despite himself. "Min-Kyu knows about the Thursday review location because I told him." Tae-hyun stopped running. He stood on the wet pavement in the thin rain and held the phone against his ear and felt the specific sensation of a thing he'd been holding as solid turning to a different substance entirely under his hands. "I've been reporting to Min-Kyu for 4 months," Yoon said, "since the consolidation started. I told myself I was maintaining access, staying close to both sides, but I told him things that helped him." A breath. "I told him 2 days ago that a relay contact of mine had flagged unusual activity in Dobonggu that might be connected to you." Taehyun did not say anything. "I didn't know about your wife," Yoon said. "I didn't know she was alive. I didn't know there was a child. I want you to know that changes—" "Did it change what you reported?" Taehyun said. A silence. "No," Yoon said. "Then it didn't change anything." "I'm telling you now," Yoon said. "I'm telling you because the 4 teams he's running are going to find them in the next 10 minutes based on the radius I gave him. And I can redirect 2 of those teams with misdirection through my contact on his security staff, but only if you tell me where your wife actually is so I know which direction to send them away from." Tae-hyun stood in the rain. There it was. The architecture of it, clean and complete. Give Yoon the location to protect them. And Yoon was a man who had been reporting to Min-Kyu for 4 months and had just told him so, which either meant Yoon was genuinely trying to course correct or meant that Min-Kyu had calculated that Tae-hyun's only move was to trust someone and had put Yoon in position to be that someone, and there was no way to know which it was from where he was standing. He thought about Amara in the apartment on the 3rd floor. He thought about Jay, less than 2 hours old, in a city full of people with standing orders to leave no evidence of the child. He thought about the drive in his hand. "I'm not telling you where they are," Taehyun said, "but I need you to do something for me anyway." "What?" "Get me into the Thursday review, whatever location Min-Kyu moved it to. Get me into that room." He started moving again, faster now. "And when I walk in, don't be surprised." He ended the call and broke into a full run, and the rain came down cold on his face, and he ran through it without feeling it, running the only calculation that mattered right now, which was whether he could get back to the apartment building before he made it back to the building in 6 minutes. 6 minutes of running through streets that were finally emptying of rain, the storm having spent itself sometime in the last hour and left behind only the wet residue of itself. Slicked pavement, dripping gutters, the smell of concrete that had been cold and wet for so long it had forgotten what dry felt like. Tae-hyun ran without caring about visibility or noise, calculating as he ran, because the time for careful movement was finished. Careful movement was for situations where you had margin. He had no margin left. He took the building's front entrance rather than the side, faster by 40 seconds, and hit the stairwell at full speed and went up 3 flights with his hand barely touching the rail. And when he came through the apartment door, the woman with no name was already on her feet and moving toward him with the expression of someone who had been listening to the building and the street for the last hour and had already registered something wrong before he arrived. "Someone walked the street twice," she said. "Same man, different direction each time, 15 minutes ago and 8 minutes ago." Grid search. Already inside the radius. "Can she move?" he said. The woman looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been asked this question twice tonight and finds it no more answerable the second time. "She just delivered a baby 2 hours ago." "I know what she just did." "Then you know what moving her means." He went to the bedroom doorway. Amara was awake. He didn't think she'd slept at all, didn't think sleep was available to her yet, in the way it would be eventually, when the body finally collected what was owed, sitting up against the headboard with Jay against her chest. And she looked at him when he came in with eyes that had already read the shape of his face and arrived at the conclusion before he said anything. "How long?" she said. "Minutes. Maybe less." She nodded once. She looked down at Jay for 1 second, just one, with the expression that he still couldn't look at directly for too long. Then she looked back up. "Tell me what to do," she said. He told her. The building had a basement access through the kitchen, a maintenance space that connected via a utility corridor to the adjacent building, a feature he knew about because he'd had the corridor put in 4 years ago when he bought both properties simultaneously through separate shells for exactly this contingency. The corridor was low and narrow and smelled like old pipe insulation, and the particular cold of spaces that never received direct heat. It was 60 meters long and ended at a steel door that opened into the basement of the adjacent building, which was a commercial printing operation that ran day shifts only and was empty and dark at this hour. He got Amara moving. The woman with no name carried Jay, wrapped and quiet, in a way that newborns sometimes are when the world is too large and new and they have not yet decided how to respond to it. They went through the kitchen and down the basement stairs and into the corridor, and Taehyun went last, pulling the basement door closed behind him. The corridor was exactly as he remembered it. He navigated it from memory in the dark, one hand on the right wall, counting his steps, because there was a junction at meter 40 where a wrong turn led to the building's main utility space and a dead end, and he needed the left branch at that junction, and he hit it at the right count and took it, and 30 seconds later the steel door at the end was in front of him. He eased it open. The printing shop's basement was stacked with paper stock and chemical containers, and the heavy, silent presence of machinery that was resting. A single emergency light provided a green-tinted orientation point. He brought them through and up the interior stairs and through the shop floor, moving between the press machines in single file, and out the shop's rear delivery door onto the alley behind the building. A car was waiting. He had called it on the run back to the building. A contact number he'd had for 6 years, a driver who operated outside the syndicate structure and who answered to simple economics and had, to Taehyun's knowledge, never failed to be where he said he would be. The car was a common sedan, silver, indistinguishable from the 80,000 other silver sedans in Seoul. The driver looked straight ahead. Taehyun put Amar in the back with Jay and the woman and got in the front, and the car moved. "Where?" the driver said. Taehyun gave him an address in Yeouido. The driver showed no reaction. In 6 years, he had never shown a reaction to any address Taehyun had given him, which was the primary reason Taehyun had kept the number. In the back seat, Amara was doing something with her breathing, a deliberate regulation of it, the technique of someone who understood that physical systems could be managed to some degree if you stayed conscious of them. She was pale in the way that effort and blood loss in 2 hours of the most physically demanding thing a body can do produce paleness, but her eyes were clear and tracking, and her jaw was the jaw he'd known for 4 years, set in the particular way it set, when she had decided that something was what it was, and she was going to be in it rather than adjacent to it. "Where are we going?" she said. "The Thursday review," he said. "The meeting where Min-kyu consolidates his leadership in front of the senior structure of the organization." A silence. "You're going to walk into his meeting," she said. "Yes." "With the drive?" "Yes." "And what happens to us while you're doing that?" He turned in the seat to look at her. "There's a location in Yeouido, separate from the meeting venue, 3 blocks from it. Clean, unregistered, stocked. You'll be there with her." He indicated the woman, who was holding Jay with the calm of someone who had survived considerably more chaotic situations than this one and had developed a philosophical orientation toward them. "I'll be in the meeting for less than 20 minutes. Either it works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I won't be coming back from it. And you'll have the car and the driver and enough cash in the location's lockbox to get out of the country." Amara looked at him. "That's your contingency," she said. "For if you die." "Yes." "You've thought about it pretty completely." "I've had a long night to think." She held his gaze for a moment. The car moved through the pre-dawn streets of Seoul, which were empty in the way that cities are empty, at 3 a.m. Not actually empty, but populated by a different category of person than the daylight hours produce, people for whom 3 a.m. is either very late or very early, and who share the streets with a mutual unspoken acknowledgement that they have both arrived here by routes that don't require explanation. "Come back," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. She delivered it the same way she'd delivered everything tonight. Flat, direct, no softness around it to cushion the weight. "Working on it," he said. He got them to the Yeouido location with 19 minutes to spare. He spent 4 of those minutes getting them inside and oriented and showing the woman with no name where the supply cabinet was and where the radio was and what frequency to monitor. He spent 2 minutes in the doorway of the room where Amara was lying back down with Jay on the bed beside her, not speaking, just standing there doing the thing he'd done with his hand against the wall earlier, being in proximity to the fact of them, because it was possible this was the last time, and he wanted the last time to be a thing he'd been present for rather than something he'd walked past in a hurry. Amara looked at him from the bed. "You have 13 minutes, she said. "I know. Stop standing in the doorway then." He almost said something. He decided against it. He had learned over 4 years with her that some things were better carried than expressed, that she read the carrying of them as clearly as she would have read words and responded to it with more trust than she gave to words, because words could be assembled, and the carrying of a thing couldn't. He left. The meeting venue in Yoito was a private club on the 14th floor of a commercial building that the organization had controlled for 9 years through a hospitality company that was, on paper, extremely successful, and in practice, a vehicle for exactly this kind of use. Tae-hyun knew the building's access system because he had designed it. He knew the elevator override because he had written the protocol for it. He knew the service entrance on the building's east side and the maintenance stairwell that ran parallel to the public elevators and emerged 1 floor below the club through a utility space that connected to the kitchen. He went in through the service entrance at 3:41 a.m. The security sweep for the Thursday review happened at 3:30. He was 11 minutes behind it, which meant the venue had been cleared and the senior structure was beginning to arrive and settle, and the security posture inside would be at its lowest point, the sweep done, the formal meeting not yet begun. The men inside in the social interval between arrival and business, where attention was distributed rather than focused. He took the maintenance stairs. 14 flights, and he took them at a pace that was not running but was not far from it, and by the time he reached the utility space below the club, his breathing was controlled, but his shirt was not dry, and the Glock in his waistband was a pressure against his ribs that he was aware of with each step. He stopped at the utility door. He listened. On the other side, kitchen sounds, low voices, the specific acoustic quality of a catered meeting space in its preparation phase. He counted 3 voices in the kitchen. Staff, not security. Security would be in the main room and at the entrance, and possibly 1 man on rotation through the corridor. He opened the door. The kitchen staff saw him. 2 of them, young, catering company uniforms, clearly with no background information about what the Thursday review was or who attended it. Here because someone had contracted their company for late-night corporate hospitality. They looked at him with the confusion of people who have no context for what they're seeing. "Get out," he said. Quiet. Absolute. They got out. The efficiency of it, the speed with which they read the tone and made the decision, was a function of whatever they saw in his face, which he was not currently managing for them. He moved through the kitchen to the service door that opened onto the main room's side corridor. He stopped. Through the door, voices, more than he'd hoped for. The senior structure was largely assembled, which meant he was going to walk into a room containing approximately 15 men, most of whom had spent the last several hours believing he was dead, and some of whom had authorized his death. And he was going to have to manage that room in the first 5 seconds, or he was not going to get to the 6th. He thought about the drive in his jacket pocket. He thought about Amara in the Yoito safe location 3 blocks away. He opened the door and walked in. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet, when something happens that doesn't fit the expected sequence of events. Not all at once, but in a spreading wave, starting at the point closest to the disruption and moving outward. Tae-hyun walked through the service door and kept walking, toward the center of the room, not stopping, not slowing, because the momentum of a man who doesn't stop is harder to interrupt than the momentum of a man who pauses to assess the response to his arrival. He counted faces as he walked. 12 men in the main room, plus 2 at the entrance who had not yet processed what they were seeing into action. Ryu was not among them. Ryu was dead or incapacitated. The message from the relay had said Ryu down, and he felt that as a specific point of weight somewhere behind his sternum and didn't let it slow him. 3 of the faces were senior captains who had publicly backed Min-kyu. 2 were faces he didn't recognize. New appointments, made in the 6 months of restructuring. The others were men he knew, men he had worked with for years, men whose expressions were now running through a sequence that went from shock through confusion toward something that hadn't resolved into a direction yet. At the far end of the room, behind the main table, Seo Min-kyu stood up. He stood up slowly. He was wearing a dark suit, and his face was the face of a man who has prepared extensively for many contingencies, and who has just encountered one that he prepared for but didn't fully believe in. "You're dead," Min-kyu said. "Keep saying it," Taehyun said. "It'll be true eventually." He reached the center of the room and stopped. He looked around at the faces, taking the inventory slowly, letting them see him doing it, letting each man understand that he was being specifically seen and specifically assessed. "I have something for everyone in this room," he said. He said it at a conversational volume because yelling was for people who weren't sure they'd be heard, and he was sure. "It takes about 4 minutes to go through. After that, anyone who still wants to shoot me is welcome to make that choice with the full information available." "Take him," Min-kyu said. 2 men moved, the ones at the entrance, who had finally resolved their confusion into action. They were halfway across the room when the room's secondary entrance, the one on the north side, the public corridor entrance, opened and Captain Yoon walked in, followed by 3 men Taehyun didn't recognize but who had the bearing and the specific quality of attention of men who were armed and positioned. The 2 men from the entrance stopped. The room recalculated. Yoon looked at Taehyun. Taehyun looked at Yoon. An entire conversation passed between them in about 1 second. The acknowledgement of the earlier call, the acknowledgement of what Yoon had admitted in that call, the understanding that Yoon was here anyway, and that whatever his reasons were, they were going to have to be enough. 4 minutes, Yoon said to the room. He said it not as a request, but as a statement of what was going to happen. Then everyone decides. Taehyun pulled out the drive. He connected it to the display system on the side wall, the same system that had been used for Thursday review presentations for 7 years, that he knew because he'd had it installed, that accepted the drive format he was holding because he'd specified that format when he wrote the procurement requirements. The display came up. The files opened. He walked them through it. 4 minutes, as promised. The commission record, the payment routing through Park Ji-hwan to Baesung-il, the technical log of the cipher replication, the specific parameters of his personal encryption format, provided to the forger as a reference, documented in Bae's record-keeping with the clinical precision of a craftsman who recorded his work like an engineer rather than a criminal. The time-stamped chain showing the commission completed 3 days before Amara had been shown the fabricated message. The chain showing payment clearance through an account that Taehyun could trace on the display in front of the room directly to a financial vehicle that Min-kyu controlled. He let the last document sit on the screen. He looked at the room. He looked at Min-kyu. Min-kyu's face had gone through several things during the 4 minutes. It had started at the cold composure of a man who believed he could manage whatever was coming. It had moved as the documents progressed, through something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man watching the structure he built being taken apart beam by beam in front of witnesses. It had arrived at something that was neither composure nor fear, but the thing that lives between them, when a very intelligent person realizes that the variables have resolved against them and begins the calculation of remaining options. "He fabricated the order that drove my wife out of Seoul 6 months ago," Taehyun said to the room. "He staged her death. He used my grief to make me into something he could aim. He spent 6 months building this." He gestured at the room, at the assembled structure, at everything Min-kyu had consolidated. On the body of a woman who wasn't dead, and the child she was carrying, and the explicit order to make sure neither of them survived long enough to change that. He paused. "My son is 3 hours old. Silence. Not the silence of the room going quiet from shock this time. A different silence. The silence of a room in which men who deal in violence and calculation are doing a very specific kind of calculation, running the numbers on what they've been part of, what their names are attached to, what the shape of the next hours and days looks like from where they're standing. Min-kyu moved. He didn't go for a weapon. Taehyun watched his hands, and his hands were empty, were open, were the hands of a man who understood that the ground had shifted and was trying to find a new position on it. He moved toward the room's north side, toward the corridor entrance, and Yoon's 3 men moved to close it, and Min-kyu stopped. "Everything on that drive was fabricated by Kang's people," Min-kyu said to the room. His voice was the voice of a man who was still trying. "He's had time to build whatever story he needed. Think about who has access to Bae's operation. Think about who..." Bae-sung-il is in Gimpo right now, Tae-hyun said. On his way out of the country. I told him to leave. You can reach him and ask him yourself if you want to spend the next 4 minutes finding out whether he answers your call or mine. Min-kyu stopped talking. One of the senior captains who had publicly backed Min-kyu, a man named Choi, who had been with the organization for 8 years, who Tae-hyun had personally recruited from a rival faction because he was one of the most tactically competent people he'd ever evaluated, stood up from the table. Choi looked at the screen. He looked at Min-kyu. He sat back down, which was not a declaration but was a withdrawal of active support, and in a room like this one, that was the same thing. Min-kyu looked at Tae-hyun across the room. The mask was gone now, not the composure. The composure was still technically present, maintained through what was clearly considerable effort. But the thing behind the mask, the version of Min-kyu that had spent 11 years wearing the face of a loyal second while he built something else underneath. That was visible now. It looked, Tae-hyun thought, almost like relief, the specific relief of a man who no longer has to hold the performance. You were never going to be enough, Min-kyu said. You know that. You were always the weapon, never the architect. I know, Tae-hyun said. You're right. Min-kyu looked at him. You were always better at building than I was, Tae-hyun continued. You built all of this. He looked around the room. The problem is what you built it on. He nodded at Yoon. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was never clean. The closing of something like this was never clean, because the men involved were not clean, had not chosen clean, would not have been in this room at 4 a.m. if clean was a priority they'd ever ranked highly. There was resistance. 2 of the men who'd been newly appointed by Min-kyu made a serious attempt, and it cost one of Yoon's men a broken forearm, and it cost Tae-hyun a cut above his left eye from a thrown object that he didn't fully track, and it ended with those 2 men restrained against the wall and the room in a new configuration. Min-kyu standing at its center, contained, not physically restrained, but surrounded by a set of variables that had resolved against him completely. Tae-hyun stood in front of him. Blood from the cut above his eye was running into the corner of his left eye, and he could feel it there, the warm and slightly stinging presence of it, and he didn't wipe it. He looked at Min-kyu, and Min-kyu looked back at him, and between them was 11 years of shared history, the building of something from nothing, the decisions made in rooms like this one, the version of friendship that exists between people who operate in the dark and have chosen each other as the one person in the dark they trust. Why? Tae-hyun said. One word. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, and Min-kyu heard the difference. Because you would never have given it to me, Min-kyu said. You would have run this until you were 60 and handed it to someone else. Someone who looked like an heir to you, someone you'd picked. You never looked at me as the answer. I was always the instrument. You were my closest friend. I was your closest tool. The composure cracked for just a moment. Just the single specific crack of someone who has been holding something for a very long time finally putting it down. There's a difference, Tae-hyun. You never saw it. Tae-hyun looked at him. He thought about the 11 years. He thought about the specific texture of that friendship, the meals, the shared danger, the accumulated weight of mutual survival. He thought about whether Min-kyu was right, whether he'd reduced a man to a function without knowing it, whether the thing that had been done to him was built on a wound he'd inflicted first. He decided it didn't change what needed to happen. You ordered my son killed before he was born, he said. Min-kyu said nothing. That's the thing I can't get past, Tae-hyun said. Everything else I could spend years arguing about. That I can't. He stepped back. Yoon, he said. Already arranged, Yoon said from behind him. The Busan block is going to be a problem. They committed publicly. They'll need... The window on the north wall of the room exploded inward. Not from a thrown object. From a shaped charge. The kind that strips a window frame in a single event and produces a pressure wave that drops everyone nearest to it. Tae-hyun went sideways from the blast rather than down, an old reflex, and came up with the Glock in his hand and his back to the wall. 3 men came through the window on fast ropes, 14 floors up, and they came through the window like they'd been standing just outside it, which meant they'd been descending from the roof, which meant this had been staged before the meeting started, which meant Min Kyu had prepared for the possibility that the meeting went wrong and had staged an extraction team on the roof of the building as an exit option. The room dissolved into chaos. Min Kyu was moving toward the window, toward the ropes, toward the extraction team, and Tae Hyun was moving too, cutting the angle, and the three men from the window were armed and using that fact, and the room was suddenly very loud and very small and full of people making fast decisions. Tae Hyun took one of the extraction team with a shot from 8 meters, center mass, and the man went back and the rope took his weight and held him there swinging, which removed him from the immediate calculation. The second man turned toward Tae Hyun and fired twice, and both shots hit the wall to Tae Hyun's left, because Tae Hyun had moved at the first sign of the turn and the second man was tracking behind him. Tae Hyun returned fire from the new position. 1 round, the man went down. The third extraction team member had gotten to Min Kyu. They were at the window. Tae Hyun ran. He covered the distance across the room in 4 seconds, which was not enough. Min Kyu was already at the window. The third man had the rope in Min Kyu's hands, and Tae Hyun arrived at the window frame and grabbed Min Kyu's jacket at the shoulder, and Min Kyu's weight was already committed outward, and the jacket held for 1 second, and then the seam gave, and then Tae Hyun had the third man's arm, and the three of them were in a compression of forces at the window frame. The rope pulling out, Tae Hyun pulling in, Min Kyu in the center, and then the third man made the calculation and released the rope to free his hand for a weapon, and the rope swung away, and Min Kyu dropped. Not far. 2 floors. The emergency landing structure on the 12th floor, a maintenance platform, caught him. Tae Hyun looked down from the window and saw him there, on his back, not moving but breathing, the shape of a man who had fallen 2 floors and not died from it, but who was also not going anywhere under his own power in the next several minutes. The third man had his weapon up. Tae Hyun turned into it rather than away from it. The counterintuitive move, the move that closed distance faster than it could be tracked. And his left hand found the weapon and pushed it offline as it fired, and the round went somewhere into the ceiling, and then Tae Hyun had the man's wrist and applied the same geometry he'd applied to the diner owner's wrist 7 hours ago, and the result was the same, and the man made the same sound, and the weapon was no longer a factor. Tae Hyun leaned against the window frame. He was bleeding from 2 places now, the cut above his eye and something along his left side that he'd been unaware of until this moment, and that suggested one of the rounds hadn't missed him as cleanly as he'd thought. He pressed his right hand against it. Not critical. The category of wound that is serious enough to need attention and not serious enough to stop what needs to happen first. He looked at the room. Yoon was on his feet. 2 of his men were down, 1 seriously, 1 not. The senior structure that had been assembled for the Thursday review was in various states of having gotten through the last 3 minutes, and the expressions on the faces ranged from shock to the specific focused recalibration that experienced men in violent situations perform automatically. Min Kyu is on the platform 2 floors down, Tae Hyun said. His voice came out steady, which cost him something he didn't audit. Get him off it before he recovers enough to move. He pulled out his phone. He called the number for the safe location 3 blocks away. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. On the 7th ring, the woman with no name answered. "We're here," she said before he could speak. "We're all here. I heard the explosion." He let out a single breath. Just one. "Stay inside," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone except me." "Obviously," she said, and clicked off. He looked out the window at the pre-dawn Seoul skyline. The Han River visible from this height, a dark moving line between the lit banks, the sky above the east horizon beginning to consider the possibility of a color that was not black. Not committing to it yet. Just considering. Behind him, Yoon was issuing instructions in the flat voice of a man who has been in rooms like this before and knows what the next hour requires. Tae Hyun turned. There were things that still needed to happen. Min Kyu on the platform below needed to be secured, and the Busan block needed to receive information that would change their calculation, and the men in this room needed to understand what the organization was going to look like on the other side of this night. There was work ahead that was political and structural and careful, the kind of work he was equipped for, the kind of work that in any other context he might have found satisfying. He was going to do all of it, and then he was going to walk away from it. He pulled his jacket closed over the wound in his side and looked at the assembled room and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of it, "Here's what happens next." And across the city, in the room where Min-kyu had staged his final bid, a room that was now 3 extraction team members short and 1 forged mandate short and 1 fabricated death. Short of the story it had been built to tell. The last of the pre-dawn dark was thinning against the east, and somewhere in Yoido a woman who had run for 6 months and crossed an ocean of fear to get to this morning was lying in a clean room with her son against her chest, listening to a city that did not yet know that the man who had ordered her death from the shadows was lying on a maintenance platform 14 floors above On-A. They found Min-kyu on the maintenance platform at 4:47 a.m. He had not tried to move. The fall had done something to his left leg. Not broken, but the specific deep damage of a joint that has absorbed an impact it was not designed for. The kind of injury that announces itself clearly and then keeps announcing itself every time you try to ignore it. He was sitting with his back against the platform railing when Yoon's men reached him, his hands open on his knees, looking at the city below with the expression of a man who has completed a long calculation and arrived at the number. Taehyun came down by the maintenance stairwell rather than the rope. He was moving more carefully than he had been 20 minutes ago. The wound in his side had graduated from ignorable to present, a persistent burning along the left ribs that tightened with each full breath, and that he was managing by breathing shallowly, which he knew was not a long-term solution but was sufficient for the next hour. The cut above his eye had clotted. His shirt was a record of the night in ways that could not be explained to anyone who hadn't been part of it. He stepped out onto the platform. Min-kyu looked up at him. The city spread out behind him, 14 stories down. Seoul in the last of the pre-dawn dark, the Han River catching what little light there was and returning it as a long silver suggestion of itself. The lights of the bridges strung above the water like arguments that hadn't finished yet. The air at this height was cold and clean and smelled like rain-washed concrete, and the faint diesel exhaust of the first delivery trucks beginning to move through the streets below. Taehyun stood over him for a moment. Then he lowered himself to the platform, slowly, sitting against the railing beside Min-kyu, because his body had been in motion for 7 hours and was presenting him with a bill that was becoming difficult to defer. And because he found that he did not want to stand over the man for this conversation. They sat side by side the way they had sat, once, years ago. A rooftop in Incheon, the early days of what would become the organization. The two of them young enough to still find something almost funny in the size of what they were attempting. He could remember the quality of that night. The cold. The particular recklessness of two people who don't yet know what they're building and are therefore not yet afraid of it. He remembered it and felt the weight of what it had become, and let the weight settle rather than pushing against it. "The drive is in front of the full senior structure," Taehyun said. "Park Ji-hwan is already in custody. Yoon's people picked him up 40 minutes ago. He gave a full account in under 10 minutes, which tells you something about what his loyalty to you was actually worth." He paused. "Bae Sung-il is somewhere over the East Sea by now. I made him a promise, and I'll keep it. He won't be coming back, which is sufficient." Min-kyu was looking at the river. "The Busan bloc will fold when they see the payment chain," Taehyun continued. "They committed publicly, but public commitments are economic decisions, and the economics just changed. Captain Han is a different problem. He's genuinely ideological about leadership transition, and he'll need to see the forgery documentation presented formally before he accepts it. That'll take another day, but he'll accept it." "You've already planned the whole recovery," Min-kyu said. His voice was flat and even, the voice of a man whose energy was going to maintaining the flatness rather than the evenness. "Of course you have. I've planned enough of it to make sure it holds without me." Min-kyu turned his head. The first time he'd looked directly at Taehyun since they'd come to be sitting here. "Without you," he said. "I'm not coming back to it," Taehyun said. "Whatever happens this morning, the leadership question, the structure, the territory, I'm not the answer to it. Yoon will manage the transition. He has enough support now, and he has the documentation, and he understands what it costs to run the thing, because he's been watching it run for 9 years. He looked at the river. "I'm done with it." Min-kyu was quiet for a moment. "Because of her," he said. "Because of a lot of things. She's one of them." You would have been done with it eventually anyway, Min-Kyu said. That was always the problem. You were always building toward an exit. You just never told me that. And I spent 11 years assuming you'd run it forever, and I built everything on that assumption. A breath. If you'd told me you were going to walk away eventually, you still would have done it, Tae-hyun said. A silence. Yes, Min-Kyu said. Probably. It was the most honest thing he'd said all night, and Tae-hyun heard it as such. He didn't know what to do with the honesty except receive it and not pretend it resolved anything, because it didn't. Honesty at the end of things is not the same as honesty that changes anything. It's just the weight of a thing, finally set down where it can be seen. The order about the child, Tae-hyun said. Min-Kyu's jaw moved. Look at me, Tae-hyun said. Min-Kyu looked at him. I need to hear you say you understand what that was, Tae-hyun said, not raising his voice, not needing to. Not strategy. Not a loose end. You ordered a child killed. A child who had been alive for 3 hours and had not chosen any part of this. The expression on Min-Kyu's face moved through several things. The composure was gone now. Had been gone since the room, since the documents on the screen, since the extraction team had not gotten him far enough fast enough. What was left was something that might have been, under different circumstances, a man's face in an unguarded moment. Something that carried, buried very deep, a quality that was not quite shame, but was adjacent to it. The specific expression of a person who has looked at one of their own actions from enough distance to see what it actually was. I understand what it was, Min-Kyu said. Then you understand why there's no version of this where we discuss terms, Tae-hyun said. Why there's no version where I weigh what we built against what you tried to do. The math doesn't work that way. Min-Kyu nodded slowly. One nod, deliberate, the acknowledgement of a man who has been playing a complex game and has reached the point where the complexity is over and only the simple thing remains. They sat in silence for a moment. Below them, the city was beginning to stir. The first light of morning pressing at the horizon, the streets beginning to receive the early movement of a city returning to itself after the night. A delivery truck somewhere below, a single set of headlights crossing the bridge over the river. For what it's worth, Min-Kyu said, the early years were real. Tae-hyun looked at the river. I know, he said. He meant it. That was the part that didn't have a clean resolution, the part that would sit with him afterward, in whatever the afterward looked like, without resolving into something that felt complete. The early years had been real. The friendship had been real, or had been real enough that the difference between real and real enough didn't matter at the time. You could not build 11 years of shared experience and have it be entirely performance. Something in it had been genuine. That something had not been enough to stop what happened. He thought about what that said about the nature of genuine things, and decided it was not a thought he was going to finish tonight. He stood. The wound in his side spoke up loudly at the motion, and he pressed his arm against it and waited for the protest to subside to its baseline level. Yoon's people are going to take you in, he said. You'll be held until the formal proceedings. The documentation makes the case clear enough that it won't require much from me. I won't need to be present for most of it. He looked at Min-Kyu. If there's anything you want said to anyone, now is when you say it to me. I'll pass it along or I won't, depending on what it is. Min-Kyu thought about this. Nothing, he said. Tae-hyun nodded. He stepped back from the railing. He looked at Min-Kyu one more time, at the man who had been his closest companion for 11 years and who had spent the last 6 months dismantling everything they'd built together on the foundation of a lie, and who was now sitting on a maintenance platform 14 floors above Seoul with a damaged leg and an ended future, and who had said, at the end, that the early years were real, which was either the truest thing he'd ever admitted or the last play of a man who had run out of others. Tae-hyun turned and went back through the stairwell door. He did not look back. The wound needed attention before anything else. He knew this the way you know things that your body is insisting on while your mind is still trying to prioritize around them. The insistence becoming impossible to manage past a certain point. Yoon met him at the bottom of the stairwell and took one look at the way he was holding his left arm against his side and made a single call without asking for permission. The doctor arrived at the building's service entrance 20 minutes later. Not the woman from Dobong-gu. A different contact, a man in his 50s who arrived with a bag and the resigned professionalism of someone who had been doing this kind of work for long enough that 5 a.m. calls no longer registered as unusual. He worked in the building's service room, which was not a sterile environment by any clinical standard, but which was what was available. The wound was a graze, a round that had caught the flesh over the lower left ribs without contacting bone, deep enough to require closing, but not deep enough to have done anything permanent. The doctor cleaned it and closed it and taped it and told Tae-hyun the things that doctors tell people in this situation: rest, antibiotics, monitoring, with the specific tone of a man who knows the advice will be followed selectively at best and is giving it anyway because it is his job to give it. Tae-hyun was out of the building by 5:40 a.m. He walked the 3 blocks to the Yeouido safe location. He walked them slowly, not because the wound demanded it, but because the city was coming awake around him in the early morning way that cities come awake. Gradually, in pieces, the first people emerging with the particular purposefulness of those who have somewhere to be before the rest of the world has committed to the day. And he found that he wanted to be in the middle of it rather than moving through it as fast as possible. He had been moving as fast as possible for 6 months. He had been moving as fast as possible for most of his adult life. The air was cold and washed clean by the night's rain, and the river was visible at the end of the cross streets as he walked, that flat silver gray of early water under early sky, and he breathed it in carefully around the tightness in his side and let the morning be what it was. He knocked on the safe location door. The woman with no name opened it. She looked at him, at the cut above his eye, at the way he was standing, at the specific quality of a man who has been through a very long night and has arrived somewhere on the other side of it that is not yet intelligible, but is at least stable. She stepped back without saying anything and let him in. The apartment was quiet. The eastern window was beginning to show the early light. In the back room, the door was open. He stood in the doorway. Amara was awake. She had been awake, he suspected, for most of the last 2 hours. Sleep was not something the body moved toward easily when it had spent the night running on fear, and the aftermath of labor, and the sustained effort of not knowing how something was going to resolve. She was sitting up in the bed with Jay asleep against her, and the light from the window was coming across both of them at a low angle. The specific light of very early morning that has no color yet, and is therefore somehow the most honest light there is. She looked at him. She looked at the cut, and at the arm pressed to his side and at his face, and she did the reading that she had always been able to do, had done it 4 years ago when they first met, had done it across every subsequent year, had apparently never lost the capacity for it despite 6 months of enforced absence and deliberate fear. And when she finished the reading, her face did not do the thing he might have expected, the relief or the softness or the release. It did something quieter than any of those. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's closed," he said. "Doctor already handled it. Come here." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, the same side he'd sat on before he left, and the mattress adjusted to his weight, and Jay shifted slightly in Amara's arms and made a small sound of protest at the disturbance without waking, and the 3 of them were in the early morning light in a room that was very still. "Min-kyu?" she said. Not a question. An inquiry about a status. "In custody. Yoon's people. The documentation is in front of the full senior structure, and the formal proceedings will move without me." "Without you," she said. "I'm done with it." She looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the platform in the rain before the drive to Nowon, measuring something, taking the weight of it, comparing the weight to something internal. "You mean it," she said. "Yes." "The last time you tried to step back from something in your world, it lasted 11 days, she said. "I know because I counted. I remember." "What's different now?" He looked at Jay, at the small sleeping face, the rise and fall of the tiny chest, the fist closed loosely beside the cheek in the way that very new people hold their hands, as if they're not sure yet what hands are for and are keeping options open. He looked at the face for long enough that the answer he was going to give, the considered, careful answer, became unnecessary, because the looking was already the answer, and they both knew it. "He is," Tae-hyun said. Amara was quiet. "And you," he said. She looked at the window. The light had shifted in the few minutes since he'd come in, was beginning to acquire color now, the first pale warmth of actual sunrise somewhere beyond the buildings, the sky moving from gray to a color that was not quite anything yet, but was on its way to being something. I spent 6 months being afraid of you, she said. Not afraid of the person I knew, afraid of the person I thought you'd become, the person Min-Kyu showed me. And then tonight She stopped, looked at her hands. I watched you in that kitchen with the skillet, and in the street, and in the truck, and I kept trying to fit what I was seeing into the story I'd been carrying, the story he built. She shook her head slightly. It didn't fit. I became worse things than Min-Kyu told you, Tae-hyun said. He didn't have to exaggerate what I was capable of. He just had to aim it. I know. I'm not asking you to. I know, she said again, more firmly. I'm not forgiving a story I haven't heard yet. I'm saying I know who you are well enough to know when someone is showing me a version of you and when they're showing me you. And what I saw tonight was you. She paused. The you that I'm also terrified of, because you're capable of things that... She stopped again, chose different words. But you. He sat with that. What do we do with that? He said. We figure it out, she said. Not tonight. Not in this room. Somewhere that isn't inside your world, where we can actually figure it out without people trying to kill us long enough to have the conversation properly. She looked at him. But we figure it out. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise or a resolution or any of the things that these moments in stories are supposed to be. It was an agreement to try, which was more honest than any of those things, and which cost both of them something real to make, because they were people who knew the difference between trying and arriving. Tae-hyun reached out and touched the side of Jae's face with 2 fingers. The same gesture he'd made in the No-On apartment when the world was still moving too fast to stop for it, and which he was making now in the stillness of the early morning, because the gesture was one he was going to keep making for as long as he was able. Jae's face turned toward it. He kept his fingers there for a moment and felt the warmth of the small face against his hand and thought about the 6 months, about the specific quality of grief that had followed the supposed death. The grief that Min-Kyu had known would be bottomless, had counted on being bottomless, had built 11 months of planning on the certainty of. It had been bottomless. He had not been wrong about that. But you could fill a bottomless thing, it turned out. Not from the top, not by adding until you ran out of adding, but by putting something inside it that had its own weight, its own gravity, its own pull toward continuation. Something that changed the nature of the space. He thought about telling Amara this and decided it was not something that needed to be said. She would arrive at her own understanding of the same territory in her own time and in her own language. And the 2 understandings would be different from each other, and neither of them would be complete, and that would be sufficient. He left the room long enough to have a conversation with the woman with no name, to settle what needed settling, to express what she was owed in terms that went beyond the debt she'd called in on his behalf, to understand what she needed from him going forward, which was the same thing she'd always needed from him, which was nothing except the continued reality of his non-interference in her operation and his occasional availability to answer a radio call. He gave her a number that would work regardless of where he was. She gave him a look that said she would decide for herself when to use it. Then he made the calls that needed to be made. Captain Yoon received a 30-minute conversation that covered the structural transition, the Busan block management, the formal documentation process for Min-Kyu's proceedings, and the specific conditions under which Tae-hyun was stepping back from any formal role. Yoon was not surprised. He had been not surprised with the particular quality of a man who had been expecting a version of this conversation for some time, and had prepared his responses accordingly. They concluded the conversation with the specific pragmatic clarity of people who have survived a difficult night together and know exactly what the morning requires from each of them. The Busan block captain received a shorter call, 12 minutes. The documentation package transmitted through secure channel in the first 60 seconds. The subsequent 11 minutes a negotiation about face-saving that Tae-hyun conducted with more patience than he felt, because the patience was necessary, and because patience was a skill he had, and the situation required it. The Busan captain committed to a formal withdrawal of support for Min-Kyu's leadership claim by 9 a.m. In exchange, he was given certain assurances about territorial continuity that Tae-hyun was in a position to give because Yoon had already confirmed them. Captain Han did not answer his call. Han had gone dark and stayed dark, and Tae-hyun left a message that was not a message but a transmission of the documentation package with a single line of text that said, "Verify the payment chain before you decide." He did not know whether Han would verify it or whether he would decide to be a problem regardless of what the verification showed. He added Han to the list of things that Yoon would need to manage, and Yoon was competent enough to manage him. By 7:15 a.m., the structure was holding. Not cleanly. Cleanly was not available, was never available in the aftermath of something like this. Because the people involved were not clean, and the situation was not clean, and the best you could say was that the worst of the instability had been addressed. And the remaining instability was the manageable kind. The kind that men like Yoon had spent their careers managing. Tae-hyun made the last call at 7:30. The man on the other end operated in a different world entirely. A legal world, a world of formal structures and documentation and the specific machinery of official processes, but a world that intersected at certain points with the one Tae-hyun was leaving, and those intersection points had been useful to both of them over the years. The conversation was brief and specific. It covered the framework for a voluntary surrender of certain organizational assets, the conditions under which certain information would be made available to authorities in ways that would enable prosecution without requiring Tae-hyun's direct cooperation, and the question of what kind of life was possible for a man walking away from the position Tae-hyun was walking away from. The answer to the last question was not simple. It was never simple. But it was possible. There were precedents, there were structures, there were specific legal instruments that addressed the specific shape of this situation. It would take time. It would require Tae-hyun to be somewhere stable and consistent and reachable while the process ran. It would require him to be somewhere. He had a place in mind. He went back to the room. Amara had slept for an hour while he was making calls. The sleep of complete physical exhaustion, the kind that takes you suddenly and completely in the middle of what you were doing, leaving you exactly where you were but offline. She woke up when he came back in, with the immediate alertness of someone who had been sleeping lightly in uncertain places for 6 months and whose nervous system had maintained its watch even through the sleep. "What time is it?" she said. "Almost 8. What happened while I was asleep?" Transition is holding. Yoon has the structure. Documentation is moving through the formal channels. He sat in the chair beside the bed. "I spoke to a lawyer, someone who handles the kind of situation I'm in. He's going to start working on a framework." Amara looked at him. "You're serious," she said. "I told you I was done with it." "People say that and then—" "I know what people do," he said. "I also know that I have a son who has been alive for approximately 5 hours, and who I would like to still be alive in 10 years. And the way I have been operating does not produce that outcome. The math is simple." She held his gaze. "It's not just math," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She nodded slowly. She looked at Jae, who had woken while Tae-hyun was making calls and who was now doing the focused, concentrated thing that very new people do when they are awake and the world is presenting itself to them. An expression of absolute present tense attention that is uncomplicated by context or history or any of the weight that accumulates in faces over time. He was looking at the ceiling with the complete seriousness of someone for whom the ceiling is the most interesting thing that has ever existed. Tae-hyun watched him look at the ceiling. He thought about the man who had stood in the rain 6 months ago and let them lower a box into the ground and told himself that the last trace of his humanity was going in with it. He thought about what he had done with that belief. The efficient, merciless, perfectly calibrated machine he had allowed himself to become in the absence of the thing that had been making him human. He thought about Min-kyu on the platform, saying the early years were real. He thought about what it meant that both things could be true, that the early years had been real, and that they had ended here, on a maintenance platform in the pre-dawn, with a man who had spent 11 years close enough to see everything, and had used the scene to build the most precise possible weapon against the person he was supposed to be closest to. He would carry that. Not as a lesson, like he had enough lessons. As a fact. The kind of fact that becomes part of the texture of how you move through the world. Not loudly, not in the foreground, but present in the quality of your attention and the decisions you make about who you let close and how close you let them. He would carry it, and it would not be simple, and it would not be resolved. That was what it meant to have been in this. 3 weeks later, in a city that was not Seoul and that had no history for any of them, Tae-hyun stood in a small kitchen in the early evening and made the kind of meal that he made badly because he had never cooked consistently in his adult life and had no particular talent for it, following instructions from his phone with the focused determination of a man applying himself to something new and refusing to be defeated by it. Amara sat at the kitchen table with Jay in her arms and watched him do it, and did not offer to help, which he had asked her not to do because he was going to learn this specific thing, and the learning required failure, and she understood that. She offered commentary instead, which was not something he had asked for, and was therefore honest. The apartment was rented under a name that did not belong to either of them, in a city that did not know them, in a country where the reach of what Taehyun was leaving behind was limited and getting more limited as the formal transition process ran its course. There were people who still wanted to find them. There would always be people who wanted to find them, for some period of time that would eventually diminish as the organization continued its transition, and the specific value of locating them decreased relative to the risks involved. Yoon had been in contact twice. Brief, informational, the communications of a man managing a situation competently and checking in with the person whose situation he was managing rather than with his superior, because that relationship had changed. The Busan bloc had held to its withdrawal. Captain Han had verified the payment chain and had gone quiet, not hostile, not aligned, simply absent from the conflict, which was acceptable. Min-kyu's formal proceedings were ongoing. Tae-hyun did not follow them closely. He had provided the documentation and the testimony and the specific technical information that the process required, and he had stepped back from it and let it run, because the alternative was remaining inside it, and remaining inside it was remaining inside the world he was leaving. And you could not leave something by half. There were things that were not finished. There were things that would never be finished. The 6 months Amara had spent running, the specific damage that had been done to the trust between them that would require not drama or declarations, but the long, patient work of ordinary days, the accumulation of small evidence, the gradual rebuilding of the thing that had been broken. It would take time that could not be compressed or accelerated. It would require both of them to be present for it rather than performing it. They were both present. On the 4th morning in the new city, Amara woke before Jae and before Taehyun and went to the window in the front room and stood looking at the street below. It was an ordinary street, residential, quiet, the specific calm of a neighborhood in the early morning that had no particular significance and no particular history, and nothing to recommend it except that it was there and they were in it. She stood at the window for a while. Taehyun woke and found her there and came to stand beside her, and he did not ask what she was thinking because he could read it in the quality of her stillness. Not sadness, not fear, not any of the categories the night had produced. Something else. Something that was perhaps the first approximation of what it felt like to stand in a place where nothing was chasing you, and nothing required your immediate action, and the person beside you was the person you had chosen and not the person you had survived. They stood there together. Jay woke and made his opinion of being left in the other room loudly known. They both turned at the same moment with the same instinctive toward him quality that was already so established after 4 days that neither of them noticed it consciously. Amara went first. Tae-hyun followed. In Seoul, the Han River moved under its bridges without knowing what had crossed above it. The organization continued its restructuring with the particular momentum of institutions that do not require any specific person to continue, which was both its nature and the thing that had allowed Taehyun to leave it, because a thing that needs you to be its center does not release you. And he had built something that did not need any single center. And that had turned out to be either the best or the worst decision of his life, depending on which 6 months you were looking at. Seo Min-kyu, in a holding facility in the Mapo district, asked twice in the first week to send a message to Tae-hyun. Both times the request was denied. On the 3rd week he stopped asking. The woman with no name remained where she had always been, between things, useful, available, absent from every record, and therefore from every target. She did not call the number Tae-hyun had given her, and he did not expect her to, and the number remained available in the way that certain resources remain available. Not used, not abandoned, simply held in reserve against the possibility of a future that none of them could fully see. Captain Yoon sat at a desk that he had not chosen and ran an organization he had inherited under circumstances he had not fully predicted and made decisions that he had not been certain he was capable of making. He made them anyway. Some of them were wrong. He corrected what could be corrected and carried what could not be. Somewhere outside Seoul, in the direction of the coast,
An old man who had sat in a corner booth of a roadside diner on the worst night of his life continued to sit in corner booths and watch things happen around him with the patience of someone who had learned that most things resolve themselves if you wait long enough and stay low enough and know when to duck.
In the kitchen of a rented apartment in a city that did not know their names, Kang Tae-hyun burned a pot of rice for the second time in 4 days and held his son with one arm while he dealt with the evidence of this failure with the other. And Amara laughed. A real laugh, unguarded. The first one since before any of this started. The laugh he had thought, standing in the rain 6 months ago, he would never hear again. And the sound of it moved through the kitchen and out into the ordinary evening of an ordinary street and disappeared into the city the way sound does, passing through walls and distance until it becomes part of the general ambient warmth of the world. Nothing that had happened was resolved. Everything that mattered was here. That was enough. That was, in the end, the only kind of enough there is.